They counted their dead by the water returned. When a Fremen died, whether from battle or accident, or the slow attrition of the desert's uncompromising demands, the body was carried to the death still. The death still extracted every drop of moisture the flesh contained. The water was measured, recorded, and added to the community's reserves, and the number that came back was the final accounting of a life, not the years lived, not the deeds done, not the prayers spoken, but the liters surrendered to the survival of those who remained. This is the Fremen. This is the logic that shaped them, not cruelty, necessity, not primitive superstition, the most refined possible adaptation to an environment that killed everything that didn't adapt completely. The desert did not permit sentimentality. The desert did not permit waste. The desert did not permit the human tendency to soften the edges of hard truths with comfortable rituals. And so the Fremen, who had been living inside the desert for longer than most civilizations had existed, had been stripped of everything the desert found unnecessary, until what remained was something that the rest of the Imperium, looking at them from the outside, struggled to understand. They were the most dangerous people alive. They were the most disciplined people alive. They were, in the specific way of things shaped by millennia of genuine extremity, the most human people alive. Human in the sense of people who had been reduced to exactly what the human animal is when every comfort and pretense has been removed, who had built their entire culture around the bare facts of survival and meaning and connection, without any of the padding that easier environments allowed. The Imperium called them desert rats. The Harkonnens called them vermin. The Imperial surveyors counted them in the hundreds of thousands, which was not simply an underestimate, but a completely different order of error, not a number that was too low by some margin, but a number generated by surveys that had not been conducted with enough care or curiosity to find what was actually there. What was actually there was a civilization, hidden, dispersed, extraordinarily capable, and waiting. Though waiting is not quite the right word for something that was simultaneously building, breeding, training, planning, and dreaming of a future that was 3 to 5 centuries away. This is the complete history of the Fremen. It begins very far from Arrakis. The people who would become the Fremen were not originally desert people. This is the first and most important thing to understand about their history, because it reframes everything that followed. The specific disciplines, the specific faith, the specific relationship with privation and endurance that made the Fremen what they were, these were not born on Arrakis. They were forged on a series of worlds across the Imperium, across thousands of years of slavery and migration and loss, until the people who finally arrived on the harshest inhabited planet in the known universe arrived already tempered by everything that tempering requires. They were Zensuni wanderers, and before they were Zensuni wanderers, they were the survivors of a religious schism so old that the specifics had been compressed into mythology, into the deep-coded traditions of a people who carried their history in their prayers rather than in their records, because records could be destroyed and prayers lived in the body. The Zen-Sunni tradition drew from 2 ancient streams, from Sunni Islam, carried forward through the vast cultural reshuffling of the human diaspora from old Earth, and from the Zen Sufi Mayumuth, a mystical school that had developed at the intersection of Islamic thought and the accumulated spiritual experimentation of humanities spread across the galaxy. What the Zen-Sunni tradition had cultivated across the centuries of its development was a specific relationship with patience. Not patience as a virtue in the abstract sense, patience as a theological principle, as the central discipline of a faith that understood suffering as instructive, that had developed the practice of waiting not as resignation, but as a form of action. As the specific thing you did when acting in the ordinary sense was not available to you. The Zen-Sunni had been people who waited. They had been people who learned to hold their purpose across generations, to pass it from parent to child in the form of practice and story and prayer, rather than depending on any external institution to maintain it for them. This was preparation. They did not know it was preparation, but the history that followed would reveal it as exactly that, the cultivation of the precise set of qualities that Arrakis would require of the people who lived in it. The slavery began, as far as the recoverable record extends, on Paul-Atreides. Paul-Atreides was a comfortable world, as worlds in the Imperium went. It had the kind of natural abundance that allowed human civilization to develop in the soft direction, to accumulate, to stratify, to produce the comfortable class and the labouring class and the institution of slavery that comfortable civilization so reliably produced when the comfortable class decided that their comfort was more important than other people's freedom. The Paul-Atreides slave masters were not uniquely cruel by the standards of the Imperium. They were simply ordinary people with power over other people, and the human tendency to use that power in whatever ways served their convenience without being troubled by the cost to those beneath them. The Zen-Sunni worked Paul-Atreides fields and mines and fabrication facilities for generations. They maintained their traditions through it, which was itself a form of extraordinary achievement. Maintaining cultural identity across generations of bondage, in circumstances specifically designed to erase it, required exactly the kind of disciplined, internally sustained cultural practice that the Zen-Sunni tradition had been developing since long before the slavery began. Their prayers were not simply prayers. They were the transmission mechanism, the vehicle by which the community kept itself coherent across time and suffering, the specific technology of cultural survival that would eventually prove as important as any physical adaptation to the desert. They left Paul-Atreides when the opportunity came, as they always left when opportunities came, not through rebellion in the dramatic sense, not through the kind of organized uprising that the histories celebrated, but through the particular combination of patience and readiness that the Zen-Sunni tradition had made their characteristic mode of escape. When the Butlerian jihad disrupted the established order enough to open a gap, when the transportation networks that had maintained the slave economy were sufficiently disrupted, the Zen-Sunni moved. They moved to Salusa Secundus. This sounds, to anyone who knows what Salusa Secundus was, like a step in the wrong direction. Salusa Secundus was the imperial prison world. It was the place the Corino emperors used to produce their Sardaukar, the legendary shock troops whose reputation was so formidable that their mere deployment in force was enough to end most conflicts before they truly began. It was a hellworld, violent and harsh, and the mechanism by which it produced soldiers of extraordinary capability was the same mechanism that any environment uses to produce extraordinary capability. It killed everyone who wasn't capable. And what remained after that selection was something that couldn't be killed easily. The Zen-Sunni spent 9 generations on Salusa Secundus, 9 generations as slaves in a prison world that was simultaneously a military training environment and an ecological nightmare. 9 generations of having the desert, because Salusa Secundus was primarily desert, rocky and hostile and utterly unaccommodating as the context of their lives. 9 generations of watching the Sardaukar selection process and understanding, with the specific intelligence of people who had been surviving oppression for longer than some civilizations had existed, that the harshness around them was not something to be resisted, but something to be learned. The Fremen would sometimes say, in later centuries, when they had become what Arrakis would make them, that they were shaped by harsher suns than the Sardaukar, and that their crucible had been deeper. They were not wrong. The Sardaukar was selected by Seleucus Secundus. Those who couldn't survive were killed, and those who survived were used. The Zensunni were not selected by Seleucus Secundus. They selected themselves. They brought to the brutal world a discipline that preceded it, added its lessons to what there already were, and emerged from 9 generations of bondage in a hell world not simply as survivors, but as something that had actively processed the experience and integrated it. What they were carrying out of Seleucus Secundus into the next stop on the long migration was the beginning of what would become the Fremen physical and psychological tradition, the specific relationship with physical hardship that understood it as teacher rather than enemy, the specific quality of endurance that went beyond the ability to suffer and extended into the ability to learn from suffering, the beginning of the water discipline that would reach its full expression on Arrakis. From Seleucus Secundus, they moved through several worlds before Arrakis. Bela Tajus, Rossak, Harmonthep, each stop added something, stripped something, and continued the long process of refinement. Rossak was the world of the sorceresses, female practitioners of psychological and mental disciplines that prefigured in some ways the Bene Gesserit techniques that would later interact so significantly with the Fremen tradition. The Zensunni, who spent time on Rossak, absorbed some of this, added it to what they carried. Harmonthep was a world that was itself marginal and difficult, that continued the desert orientation that Seleucus Secundus had established. At each stop the people thinned and hardened and shed what the journey couldn't sustain, keeping only what was strong enough to survive the next stage of a migration that had been running for thousands of years before it finally, at last, reached the planet that would complete it. Arrakis, the place they had been, without knowing it, making themselves ready for. The specific mechanism by which the Zensunni arrived on Arrakis is not entirely clear in the historical record, partly because the historical record of this period was not maintained by the people who were doing the arriving. What is clear is that they came in waves, not all at once, and that the early arrivals had to survive on a world that had essentially no infrastructure for human life before they could begin building any. The early Fremen, the earliest people we might reasonably call by that name, the people who first began establishing the sietch communities that would become the foundation of desert life, were surviving in conditions that would have killed most populations within months. They didn't die. They had been preparing for this, without knowing it, for thousands of years. The sietch was the foundation of everything. The word itself, in the Fremen language, referred to a cave or deep desert gathering place, a location where a community could exist underground, protected from the lethal surface environment, maintaining the temperature and humidity that human biology required, while the world above tried to kill everything that wasn't adapted to it. The early sietches were not comfortable by any standard that the Imperium would have recognized. They were carved from rock, expanded by hand over generations, maintained by a discipline that made the word discipline feel inadequate. Every sietch was a water reclamation system. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is the literal engineering reality of what a sietch had to be in order to function. The desert surface of Arrakis at the equatorial latitudes where most human activity was concentrated was so dry that an unprotected human body would begin losing fatal quantities of moisture within hours. The sietches had to capture every molecule of moisture that came into them and prevent every molecule from leaving. The ventilation systems carved into the rock oriented to capture any atmospheric humidity, designed with the precision of people who understood that every litre of water they failed to capture was a litre their community might die for. Were engineering achievements that the Imperium's technicians, when they eventually looked at them carefully, found genuinely impressive. The water economy of the sietch determined everything. It determined the social structure, who counted water, who distributed water, what the obligations were between community members in terms of water sharing, what happened to the water of the dead. It determined the religion, how water figured into the sacred, what the relationship was between the Fremen's god and the water that God had hidden in the rock beneath the desert. It determined the ethics, what it meant to weep for someone you had lost, what it meant to spend your body's moisture on another person's grief. It determined the law, what crimes against the community's water supply were punishable by death, what the rights of community members were in terms of their share of the shared resource. The death still was not barbarity. The death still was the water economy operating at its most complete. A Fremen who died had spent their life contributing to the community's survival. Their body contained water that the community needed. To waste that water to perform the burial rites of worlds where water fell from the sky and rivers ran to the sea and nothing about moisture was precious, would have been the genuine barbarity, the cavalier disposal of a resource that other people needed to live. The death still was the final act of community membership, and it was conducted with the same respect and solemnity that any society brought to its funerary traditions, because it was understood for exactly what it was, the last gift. The crysknife was the most sacred object in Fremen culture, and understanding what it was and why it was sacred tells you almost everything you need to know about the Fremen's relationship with Arrakis. The crysknife was made from the tooth of a sandworm, not crafted to resemble a tooth, made from an actual sandworm tooth, crystallized through a process of treatment that the Fremen had developed over generations, shaped and polished into a blade that retained the specific properties of the worm's own biology, in particular. A certain instability when removed from a living Fremen's electromagnetic field that could cause the blade to deteriorate rapidly if it was passed to an outsider who didn't know how to maintain it. The crysknife was sacred because the sandworm was sacred. The sandworm was sacred because it was the source of the spice, and the spice was the chemistry of the desert, the substance that the desert breathed out, the compound that lived in every Fremen's blood and had been living in every Fremen's blood since they first began eating the desert's food and drinking the desert's water and breathing the desert's air. To carry a crysknife was to carry a piece of the desert god. To be trusted with a crysknife was to be trusted with the most intimate thing the desert offered. The crysknife came with specific obligations. A drawn crysknife could not be sheathed without drawing blood. This was not theatrical violence, it was a statement about commitment. When you drew the blade, you were committing to something. There was no halfway with a crysknife, no drawing the sacred object and then reconsidering, no brandishing it as a threat and then backing away. The blade, once drawn, required completion. It required the blood that made the commitment real. This is the Fremen moral philosophy in physical form. Not the philosophy of people who made promises lightly and reconsidered them when circumstances changed. The philosophy of people who understood that some things, once initiated, had to be carried through. The desert had taught this with the same method it taught everything, by making the failure to carry through fatal. If you committed halfway to a sandworm ride and then lost your nerve, you died. If you committed halfway to a desert crossing and turned back, you might die. The crysknife encoded this lesson in the deepest form possible, as religious obligation, as sacred law, as the thing that made you Fremen when you submitted to it and revealed you as something else, if you couldn't. The crysknife was also an identity document. Every Fremen had one. A person without a crysknife was not fully a member of the community. When Paul Atreides arrived among the Fremen and underwent the ritual combat that was the price of admission to the sietch community, what he was purchasing with Jameis's life was not simply permission to stay. He was purchasing the right to carry the blade. To be inside the tradition rather than outside it. To be Fremen in the meaningful sense rather than simply a person surviving in Fremen company. The stillsuit was the other great technological achievement of the Fremen civilization, and like most of what the Fremen produced, it was a technological achievement that the Imperium tended to underestimate because it came from people the Imperium underestimated. The stillsuit was a full-body garment that reclaimed the moisture of the body wearing it. Perspiration was captured, filtered, and recycled. Exhalation was directed through nose filters that extracted the moisture. The waste of the body was processed. The recovered water was returned to the wearer through a drinking tube at the collar. In a properly maintained, well-fitted stillsuit worn by someone who knew how to move in it. A person could traverse open desert for days on the water their own body produced. The stillsuit was not accidental. It referred to the distillation process, the extraction of pure water from the body's various outputs. The suit was a walking distillery, a wearable water reclamation system of extraordinary sophistication. Imperial technicians who examined Fremen stillsuits were consistently impressed by the quality of the engineering, which was not the engineering of a culture with access to advanced fabrication facilities, but the engineering of a culture that had been iterating on a critical technology for thousands of years, discarding what failed and refining what worked under the most rigorous possible testing. Conditions. The testing conditions of actual desert survival. The stillsuit was also a social and cultural artifact. The fit mattered. A poorly fitted stillsuit was a death risk, and the Fremen who maintained the sietches stillsuits, the calibrators, the seamers, the people who understood the engineering well enough to ensure that every suit in the community was performing at the level survival required, were valued members of the community in the specific way that anyone is valued who does the work that keeps everyone alive. Children learned to wear stillsuits before they could read. This was not a choice or a curriculum decision. It was the same category of thing as learning to breathe. Because in the desert, not knowing how to properly seal and maintain your stillsuit was roughly equivalent to not knowing how to breathe. The desert did not offer remedial education. It offered one lesson, and it offered it once. The sandwalk was the other physical discipline that desert survival required, and it too was taught to children before they could read. The sandwalk was a specific gait, a rhythmic, varied, unpatterned, that did not produce the regular vibrations that sandworms tracked. A person walking with a normal human gait across open sand, with the regularity of step that human bipedal locomotion naturally produced, was broadcasting a signal in the substrate. Here I am, here is my rhythm, come and eat me. The sandwalk disrupted that signal. It substituted the irregular movement of wind-blown sand for the regular movement of a living creature, making the walker invisible to the worm's sensory apparatus. Learning the sandwalk was learning to move in a way that was fundamentally contrary to how the human body wanted to move. Human walking is economical precisely because it is regular. The pendulum swing of the legs, the natural rhythm of bipedal locomotion, evolved to minimize energy expenditure. The sandwalk was expensive. It required constant conscious override of the body's habitual movement patterns, constant deliberate irregularity, constant attention. Children who had learned the sandwalk from the beginning had an easier time of it. The habit was established before the efficient habit, and the sandwalk simply was how you moved. Adults who came to the desert without the sandwalk had to fight their own bodies to stay alive. Paul Atreides learned the sandwalk. He learned it with the specific advantage of Bene Gesserit training that gave him unusual control over his own body's movements, and he learned it under the pressure of actual desert survival, which is the best teacher. But even with his training, the accounts suggest that it took time, that the learning was real, that the desert's demands were not met simply by a person who had the right genetic gifts and the right prior training. They had to be met through actual work. The religion of the Fremen was not simply religion in the way that the Imperium used the word. It was not a set of beliefs held by people who attended services and consulted priests and otherwise conducted their lives in ways that were not fundamentally shaped by what they believed. It was a total orientation, a complete framework through which everything was understood, through which the desert itself was understood, through which the relationship between human life and the larger forces that governed that life was understood. Shai-Hulud was the desert god, not a metaphor for the divine or a symbol of ultimate power, the actual sandworm, the creature that moved through the desert depths and made the spice and killed the unwary, and had been doing all of these things since before any human being had ever set foot on Arrakis. The Fremen had taken the sandworm and made it sacred, and in doing so, they had done something that was simultaneously deeply human and specifically Fremen. They had found the divine in the real thing that actually governed their environment, rather than in some imagined power operating behind the scenes. Shai-Hulud was old. The sandworms had been on Arrakis for millions of years, the geological record suggested, and the Fremen oral tradition encoded this age in specific terms: the old man of the desert, the antiquity, the names that gestured at a duration that exceeded human comprehension. To live in the presence of something that old, that large, that indifferent to human concerns, and to organize your religious understanding around it, this was not primitive. This was specific. This was the religion that Arrakis demanded of the people who lived in it, the religion that corresponded to what was actually there rather than to what human psychology would have preferred to be there. The spice was the breath of Shai-Hulud, or rather, the spice was the product of the sandworm life cycle, and the Fremen understood this in a way that translated into religious language, the Maker's exhalation, the gift of the desert god, the substance that lived in the Fremen body and opened certain doors in the Fremen consciousness. The spice trance was the religious experience, the state achieved by deep immersion in high concentration melange, the altered consciousness that the Fremen Sayadinas used for specific purposes that we will examine more carefully shortly. The trance was not drug-induced stupor. It was drug-induced contact with something that the unaltered consciousness could not access, and, in the Fremen framework, that something was the divine. This is what the Bene Gesserit understood when they designed the Missionaria Protectiva. It is what made the Missionaria Protectiva possible, and understanding what it was and what it did is essential to understanding what the Fremen became. The Missionaria Protectiva was the arm of the Bene Gesserit dedicated to the preparation of what they called the religious infrastructure of superstition. The sisterhood had, over thousands of years of operating as a power in the Imperium, developed a sophisticated understanding of how religious belief functioned in human communities, what mythological structures were most durable, what prophecy forms were most flexible, what kinds of divine expectation were most readily fulfilled by someone who knew the expectation existed and could shape their presentation accordingly. They planted these structures in susceptible populations across the Imperium. Not randomly, strategically, on every world where the Bene Gesserit had reason to believe that one of their sisters might someday need protection or access, they seeded prophetic traditions designed to be recognizable to a trained sister and exploitable by a trained sister. The prophecies were always flexible enough to fit actual circumstances without being so vague as to be meaningless. They always contained elements that only a Bene Gesserit trained person could produce on demand. They always pointed toward a figure of power, a Mahdi, a voice from the outer world, a chosen one that a sister could claim to be or could position someone else to claim to be. The Missionaria Protectiva visited Arrakis. They visited it specifically because Arrakis was the spice world, because the spice world was the most strategically important location in the Imperium, because anyone who might ever be caught up in the politics of the spice world might need the kind of protection that a prepared mythological infrastructure could provide. What they found on Arrakis was a receptive population. The Fremen were already religious. They already had a tradition of the Sayadina, the female religious leaders, the women who held the spice wisdom and conducted the spice trance and maintained the community's relationship with the divine through Shai Hulud. They already had prophecy traditions rooted in the specific quality of Fremen existence, the expectation of change, the hope for a transformation of the desert world that would make it something other than what it was. The Missionaria Protectiva did not replace this tradition. They added to it, carefully and specifically, the elements that would eventually be most important: the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. The off-world prophet, the one who would come from elsewhere and know what the Fremen knew without having been born to it, who would be able to walk in the desert and speak the holy language and call the worms and lead the people to the paradise that was always in the Fremen religious imagination, the green world, waiting beneath the sand. The Bene Gesserit made this expectation specific enough to be genuinely useful. They gave the prophecy physical details, signs that the Mahdi would show, things the prophet would know, tests the prophet could pass. And then they waited, because the Bene Gesserit were nothing if not patient. They were not thinking of Paul Atreides. They were not planning for Paul Atreides specifically. The breeding program that would produce Paul was still generations away from completion when the Missionaria Protectiva did its work on Arrakis. They were simply laying the groundwork, creating the infrastructure, preparing the soil for a plant they hoped to grow someday. The irony that what grew was something they had not entirely planned for, something that exceeded their intentions in ways that disturbed them deeply, is one of the great ironies of the Dune saga. But we are getting ahead of the story. What the Fremen were building in parallel with the religious infrastructure that the Missionaria Protectiva was adding to was something the Imperium had no idea existed, the most ambitious terraforming project in the known universe. Pardet Kynes arrived on Arrakis as the Imperial planetologist at a time when the Fremen were already deeply established in their desert culture, but had not yet found the specific mechanism for the transformation they desired. He was a scientist, an ecologist of genuine brilliance, a man who understood planetary systems in ways that the Imperium's administrators did not understand them and did not particularly want to understand them. The Imperium sent him to Arrakis to study the spice ecology, to understand why the spice existed and how to maximize its production, and to produce reports that would be filed and ignored, because what the spice administrators wanted was not understanding, but output. Kynes had other interests. He encountered the Fremen almost accidentally, in the way that the most consequential encounters sometimes happen, through the specific combination of curiosity and misfortune and the kind of genuine human decency that was unusual enough in the Imperium's power structures to be remarkable. He saw Harkonnen soldiers brutalizing Fremen workers, and he intervened. And in intervening, he began a relationship with the desert people that would change both him and them permanently. The Fremen tested him as the Fremen tested everything, not through formal examination, but through observation, through watching how he moved in the desert, how he understood what he saw, how he responded to what the desert asked of him, and what they found in this imperial scientist who had come to study their world was someone who saw Arrakis the way they had always felt it should be seen, not as a hostile environment to be managed and exploited, but as a system to be understood and, in understanding, potentially transformed. Kynes had a vision that the Fremen immediately recognized as sacred. He believed Arrakis could be made green. Not quickly, not in any individual's lifetime, or their children's lifetime, or their grandchildren's lifetime. He calculated the timescales that ecological transformation at planetary scale required, and he produced estimates that were measured in centuries, 300 to 500 years, before the surface ecology would begin to show the changes that his program would initiate, before the moisture that the wind traps would capture would begin to accumulate in quantities that plants could use and animals could drink, and humans could live beside in something other than the desperate water-counting discipline of desert survival. 300 to 500 years. The Fremen heard this and understood it as a holy timeline, not as a disappointment, as a confirmation of what the desert's patience had always taught them. The Fremen had been waiting for the transformation of their world since the first generation to live in the sietches. They had maintained their hope across centuries already. 3 to 5 centuries more was not a defeat. It was a calling. Kynes became Fremen in every sense that mattered. He married a Fremen woman. He had a son who would be known as Liet Kynes, who would inherit both his father's ecological vision and his father's dual identity, the imperial planetologist on the surface, the accepted leader and ecological prophet among the Fremen in the depths of the desert. He learned the sandwalk and the stillsuit disciplines and the specific knowledge of the desert that could only be learned by living in it. And he trained the Fremen in the science of terraforming, giving them the technical vocabulary to understand what they were doing and why it would work, translating the ecological principles into the religious framework that the Fremen already had, and finding that the translation was not difficult because the ecological principles and the religious framework were pointing at the same thing: a world that was alive in a different way than it currently was. The program began. Wind traps went up in the protected areas, collecting atmospheric moisture. Pioneer plants were introduced in sheltered locations where the sandworms didn't reach, or didn't reach yet. The water counts in the sietches began a long, slow, generational accumulation. Not toward immediate use, toward the future, toward the day when the aquifers deep beneath the sand would be full enough to begin releasing their water in a managed way, toward the transformation that Kynes had calculated was possible, and that the Fremen now believed was holy. This was the Fremen secret that the Imperium most completely failed to understand, not the military capability, though the military capability was also underestimated, not the population numbers, though those too were vastly underestimated. The dream. The specific, detailed, technically sophisticated, religiously animated dream of making their world something different from what it was. A dream that had been running for generations before Kynes arrived, and that would continue running for generations after Paul Atreides came and changed everything faster than anyone had planned. The Harkonnen occupation of Arrakis, 80 years of brutal extraction, casual cruelty, and strategic blindness, did something to the Fremen that the Harkonnens would have prevented if they had understood it was happening. It made them better fighters than they already were. The Fremen were already exceptional fighters. This was not primarily a product of training in any formal sense. It was a product of what the desert demanded of everyone who lived in it. Physical fitness was not optional in the desert. Reaction time was not optional. The specific kind of awareness that the desert required, total, continuous, attentive to everything, because anything might be the warning sign of a worm or a rival sietch or a temperature change that could become fatal. This awareness was not a military skill that had been cultivated deliberately. It was the baseline condition of desert survival, applied to human beings for enough generations to become characteristic. The combat training was built on top of this baseline. The Fremen fighting traditions drew on what the generations of hardship had produced and refined it through specific practice. The Weirding Way, a term that would later attach itself to the Bene Gesserit techniques that Paul would teach them, but which referred in its original Fremen form to the specific fighting discipline of desert people, was not simply a collection of techniques. It was a philosophy of violence as the last resort of a people who could not afford prolonged conflict, violence executed with maximum efficiency and minimum waste, violence that ended quickly because prolonged fights consumed resources that the desert didn't let you have. The Harkonnen occupation added a specific dimension to this sustained guerrilla warfare against a superior force. The Harkonnens had more troops, more technology, more institutional resources, and the political backing of the Imperium. The Fremen had the desert. They had the knowledge of every dune and rock formation and seasonal wind pattern and sandworm migration route across thousands of square kilometers of terrain that the Harkonnen forces were operating in without understanding. They had the ability to appear and disappear in the sand with a speed and completeness that the Harkonnen military found genuinely bewildering. They had the patience to wait for exactly the right moment, the right vulnerability, the right configuration of opportunity before striking, and then to strike with a precision that maximized damage to the enemy while minimizing exposure to themselves. What the Harkonnens were producing, by treating the Fremen as vermin to be managed rather than people to be reckoned with, was a military force of extraordinary capability that had been being forged in the specific conditions of 80 years of low-grade war. Not war in the sense of pitched battles, war in the sense of an ongoing contest for survival in which the Fremen consistently won. Not because they were winning formal military engagements, but because they were continuing to exist, continuing to operate, continuing to bleed the Harkonnen operations without being eliminated. The Harkonnen estimates put the Fremen population at the hundreds of thousands, scattered across the deep desert in small nomadic bands. The actual Fremen population, living in the sietches and the cave systems and the deep desert refuges that the Harkonnen surveys had missed because the surveys had been conducted without genuine curiosity about what they might find, was millions. Thufir Hawat, the Atreides mentat, who would eventually have reason to look carefully, estimated the population at something over 5 million. The true number may have been higher. The Harkonnens had created this population and this capability through decades of oppression that had done exactly what oppression always does when it fails to be total enough to prevent the survival of the culture it is attempting to suppress. It had given the Fremen a specific, focused, personally experienced grievance to attach to their already formidable fighting capacity. Liet Kynes was, in a sense, two people simultaneously. Liet Kynes carried his father's ecological vision and his father's position as imperial planetologist, which meant he conducted himself in imperial circles as the legitimate academic administrator that his title described. He filed reports, he attended official functions, he maintained the fiction of neutrality that the imperial position required. He also carried his father's place in the Fremen community, which was deeper and more genuine than anything the imperial title could capture. Liet was Fremen. He had been raised in the sietches by a Fremen mother. He knew the sandwalk from childhood. He had taken the water vow. He had participated in the spice trance. The dual identity was not a deception that he maintained with difficulty. It was the natural expression of someone who had been born at the intersection of two worlds and who had the genuine capability to exist fully in both. His daughter Chani would eventually become one of the most important people in the story of Arrakis' transformation. His work continued the terraforming program his father had started, adding the weight of a generation's more observation and the growing confidence that came from seeing the early results. Not dramatic results, not results visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but the specific accumulation of data that told an ecologist that the system was responding, that what had been planted was growing, that the moisture counts were trending in the right direction. The Fremen, who understood what he was doing, and not all of them understood the technical details, though all of them understood the religious significance, spoke of the dream with the specific intensity of people who had been carrying a vision for so long that the carrying had become part of their identity. The dream of green Arrakis, of open water, of a world that could sustain human life without the constant discipline of the death still and the water economy, was not a fantasy they indulged. It was a promise they maintained. There was a specific Fremen phrase for it: the spice will flow and the desert will bloom. They meant both, not either or, not the transformation of the desert at the expense of the spice ecology. The specific ecological program that Kynes had designed was careful about this. It was not designed to eliminate the sandworms, not designed to eliminate the spice, not designed to destroy what made Arrakis Arrakis. It was designed to introduce a margin, a green zone in the polar regions, and the sheltered areas where the worm ecology didn't dominate, where water could pool and plants could grow and something other than sand could accumulate. The worms would keep the deep desert. The Fremen would have something else as well. This specificity is important. It tells you something about the intelligence of the Fremen ecological program that even now, after everything that happened, is not always credited to them. They were not dreaming of a world without the desert god. They were dreaming of a world where the desert god had some company. The spice trance deserves its own examination, because it is one of the most significant things the Fremen possessed, and one of the things most often described in terms that don't fully capture what it was. The spice trance was a religious practice. It was also a cognitive practice. It was also, in a way that the Bene Gesserit were very interested in, a genuinely transformative experience that opened specific kinds of perception to those who underwent it correctly. The Sayadina, the Fremen women who held the religious authority in the sietch, who trained in the use of the spice trance and conducted the rituals that used it, were not simply priestesses in the sense of performing ceremonies for congregations. They were practitioners of a specific discipline that combined the deep spice saturation of a lifetime of Arrakis, living with specific techniques for navigating the altered consciousness that the spice produced. The Fremen were all living in spice. It was in their food and their water and the air they breathed, and their bodies had adapted to it in ways that off-worlders' bodies had not. But the Sayadina went further. They used the concentrated form deliberately, in ritual contexts, for specific purposes. One of those purposes was a version of what the Bene Gesserit would recognize as the spice agony. The Sayadina drank a preparation called the water of life, the bile of a drowned sandworm, one of the most toxic substances in the known universe to anyone whose body could not process it. Most people who drank it died immediately. A Sayadina who survived the water of life was transformed. She gained access to what the Fremen tradition called the collective memory, the accumulated experiences of all the Sayadinas who had come before her, a kind of ancestral consciousness that was not quite other memory in the Bene Gesserit sense, but was related to it, was pointing at the same thing that the Bene Gesserit's most sacred ordeal pointed at. The male Fremen did not have this access. This is a significant detail that will become more significant as the story develops. The female religious tradition was specifically female, specifically tied to the water of life, specifically unavailable to male practitioners regardless of their capabilities or their commitment. When Paul Atreides eventually took the water of life, an act that no male had ever survived, an act that the Fremen tradition would have said was impossible, and survived it, what he demonstrated was not simply physical toughness. He demonstrated something that the Fremen religious tradition had been prepared by the Missionaria Protectiva's careful seeding to understand as a divine sign. But this is again getting ahead of the story. What is important here is that the spice trance was real, genuinely real, not a performance or a placebo. The spice did something to human consciousness. The Fremen had been living inside the spice for long enough that their bodies had adapted to its effects in ways that off-worlders hadn't, and the Sayadinas were the people who had taken that adaptation furthest and most deliberately. When they said that the spice trance opened them to the vision of Shai Hulud, to the presence of the desert god, they were not speaking purely metaphorically. They were describing an experience that was happening in their consciousness, shaped by the specific biochemistry of melange interacting with the specific adaptation that Fremen biology had developed. The Fremen children who were born in the sietches had blue within blue eyes. This was the physical marker of spice saturation, the spice changing the color of the iris over time, producing the specific shade of blue that marked a Fremen as Fremen to anyone who knew what they were looking at. An off-worlder who lived on Arrakis long enough would develop the same eyes. The eyes were not a genetic trait of the Fremen people. They were what the desert did to human eyes when the desert had had long enough to do it. The political situation on Arrakis during the late Harkonnen period was more complex than the official imperial accounts suggested, and understanding the complexity is necessary for understanding why what happened when the Atreides arrived happened the way it did. The Spacing Guild maintained its navigational monopoly on Arrakis as everywhere else, which meant that the Guild had a presence, invisible, unacknowledged, but real, in everything significant that happened on the planet. The Guild's primary interest was the spice, and the Guild's primary interest in the spice was maintaining the flow of it without disruption. The Guild had been bribed, consistently and generously, with spice by the Fremen, something the official record of the period did not acknowledge, because the Fremen were officially not there in the numbers, or with the organizational capacity required to bribe the Guild, which should have been a hint that the official record of the period was significantly wrong. The bribe secured the Guild's cooperation in ensuring that certain satellite imagery was unavailable, that certain survey data was compromised, that the Fremen's underground sietches remained invisible to the imperial administrative apparatus that was theoretically overseeing Arrakis. The Guild didn't particularly care about Fremen politics or Fremen culture or what the Fremen were doing in their sietches. The Guild cared about the spice, The Fremen had spice. The arrangement worked. This arrangement is a demonstration of something important about Fremen political intelligence. They were not naive. They were not the simple desert nomads that the Harkonnen administrators described in their reports. They understood the political landscape they were operating in, understood what the various powers that touched Arrakis wanted and feared, understood how to use those wants and fears to create the conditions their own survival required. The bribery of the Spacing Guild was a sophisticated diplomatic achievement that required understanding the Guild's motivations well enough to identify what the Guild would accept, acquiring the spice to offer it, and maintaining the arrangement across generations, because the arrangement had been running for generations before Paul Atreides arrived. The Bene Gesserit maintained a different kind of presence on Arrakis, through the specific channel of their missionaria protectiva work and through the ongoing cultivation of the Fremen Sayadina tradition. The Reverend Mothers knew more about what the Fremen were doing than the Harkonnens did, partly because they had been paying attention for centuries, and partly because the religious tradition that connected the Fremen Sayadinias to the Bene Gesserit's own practices created channels of communication that the Harkonnens didn't understand existed. Liet Kynes navigated all of this with the specific skill of someone who had been born at the intersection of worlds and had spent his entire life translating between them. His position as Imperial planetologist gave him access to official Imperial intelligence about Arrakis. His position as the Fremen's accepted ecological leader and spiritual authority gave him access to the underground knowledge that was vastly more accurate. The combination gave him a picture of the planet's political situation that no one else had, and the use he made of this picture was careful and strategic and consistently oriented toward the one goal that governed all of his decisions: the protection of the terraforming program and the continued survival of the Fremen communities that were carrying it forward. When Duke Leto Atreides arrived on Arrakis to replace the Harkonnens as the planet's administrators, Liet Kynes assessed him with the eye of a man who had seen many administrators come and go, and who understood better than anyone what it would take for an administrator to actually be different from the Harkonnens rather than simply different in style. What he observed about Leto in their initial encounters, the Duke's genuine curiosity about the desert ecology, his serious attention to what the planet was rather than simply what it could produce, his treatment of the people around him as human beings whose concerns mattered, these were encouraging signs. But Kynes had been encouraged before, and been disappointed, and he maintained the Fremen's characteristic patience about what the Atreides would ultimately be. He would not live long enough to find out fully. The Harkonnen conspiracy that destroyed House Atreides came quickly, before the relationship between the new administrator and the Fremen could develop into something genuinely new. Kynes died in the desert, stranded without equipment after the attack, his mind producing visions of his father as the spice and the elements took him. He died as he had lived, in the desert, thinking about the ecology. His daughter Shani survived, and Shani would be the Fremen who most completely changed the story of what happened next. Paul Atreides arrived in the desert as a 15-year-old boy who had lost everything. His father was dead. The House Atreides had been destroyed through a conspiracy that combined Harkonnen treachery with Imperial betrayal. A conspiracy that used the weakness of a man who loved his captive wife more than his loyalty to his masters, who broke the supposedly unbreakable Suk conditioning for the worst and most understandable reasons. The boy who had grown up on the waterworld of Caladan, who had been trained since birth for leadership and governance, and the specific combination of Bene Gesserit discipline and Mentat analytical capability that his mother had cultivated in him, who had dreamed of Arrakis for years without fully understanding why, this boy was now in the deep desert. without support, without resources, without anything except what his training had given him, and the specific inherited capabilities that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program had been working toward for 90 generations. He had his mother Jessica, who was more capable than most armies in terms of the specific things that Bene Gesserit training produced. He had the dreams, which were becoming clearer now that he was on the planet they had been showing him. And he had, in the survival knowledge he had been given as part of his desert power training, some theoretical understanding of what the desert demanded. Theory and practice are different things. The desert is particularly clear about this. What saved Paul and Jessica in the first days was the encounter with the Fremen patrol under Stilgar. And what made that encounter end well rather than badly, what made Stilgar decide that this off-world boy and his Bene Gesserit mother were worth integrating into the sietch rather than simply becoming another source of recovered water, was a combination of factors that the Fremen tradition was specifically configured to recognize. Jessica used the Missionaria Protectiva's installed patterns. She knew them, as every Bene Gesserit knew them, as part of the training that prepared a sister for whatever situation she might find herself in. She used the specific phrases and the specific references that the Missionaria had prepared generations earlier, and she watched the Fremen respond to them in exactly the way the Missionaria had designed them to respond, with the specific resonance of people encountering something that their deepest expectations had been preparing them for. Paul was something else. He was not simply a Bene Gesserit product claiming the prophetic mantle. He was someone who could do things that the prophecy described, who knew things that the prophecy said he would know, who moved and spoke and perceived in ways that the Fremen's long-cultivated expectation recognized as signs. Not because he was performing, because he genuinely was the thing the Missionaria Protectiva had prepared them to recognize more completely than the Missionaria had intended. The test came in the form of Jamis. Jamis was a Fremen fighter who challenged Paul's right to join the sietch, and the challenge was ritual and deadly formal combat to the death with krisk knives. The Fremen did not challenge outsiders who came into their communities frivolously. The challenge was the filter, the test that separated those who were genuinely capable of being Fremen from those who simply wanted to be protected by Fremen. Paul killed Jamis. He killed him more easily than he expected to, and the ease troubled him in specific ways that the Fremen, watching, found significant. A man who was sorry to win, who wept water, real water, actual tears, over the man he had killed in a fight the man had provoked, was a man who understood the cost of violence, even when the violence was necessary. The Fremen had a specific cultural understanding of what it meant to spend water on grief. They had seen the grief of people who had lost someone, and they had understood the grief's depth precisely because water was the measure of its sincerity. A man who cried over an enemy was a man who had access to something that the desert valued. Stilgar gave him a sietch name. Paul chose his own desert name. The sietch name was Usul, the base of the pillar, a name given in the tradition of naming what a person was to the community rather than what they were to themselves. Usul was the name that belonged to Sietch Tabba, the name that would be spoken inside the community, and would carry the weight of what Paul had earned by his presence and his tears and his willingness to kill when killing was required. The desert name Paul chose for himself was Muad'Dib. The Muad'Dib, the desert mouse, the kangaroo mouse of Arrakis, the creature that survived in the harshest conditions through perfect adaptation, whose shape was traced on the second moon that hung in the Arrakeen sky, was a name that carried specific meaning. It was not a prophetic name in the sense of claiming the Lisan al-Gaib. It was a practical name, a name that said, This person belongs here. This person is capable of what belonging here requires. The mouse that lived where other creatures died. The small thing that was perfectly equal to what its world demanded. The prophetic claims would develop later, partly through Paul's own capabilities and partly through Jessica's deliberate deployment of the Missionaria Protectiva materials. But they began with Stilgar's practical recognition that what stood before him was genuinely capable of being what he needed it to be. The 2 years that Paul spent learning to be Fremen were not simply the backstory to the war that followed. They were, in a real sense, the most important period of his life, the period in which the intersection of what he had been with what the desert required of him produced what he actually became. He learned the sandwalk, not from theoretical instruction, but from Chani, who taught him the way Fremen children were taught, through example and repetition and the immediate feedback of a desert that couldn't be fooled. Chani was not, in these early months, the mythological figure that the story would eventually make her. She was a Fremen woman, the daughter of Liet Kynes, trained in the desert disciplines from childhood, assessing this off-world boy with the specific evaluating eye that the desert trained into everyone who lived in it. She found him capable. She found him willing to learn, which was more valuable than capability, because capability, without the willingness to learn, was just pride. He learned the krisk knife, the weight of it, the specific balance of a blade made from something that had been alive inside one of the largest creatures on the planet, the obligations that came with it. The obligation not to sheathe it without drawing blood was not a technicality he learned and stored mentally. It became a principle he embodied, a way of understanding commitment that shaped how he made decisions in every domain. He learned the worm calling, the thumper, the device that generated the specific vibration in the substrate that drew sandworms to the surface. Was a technology so simple it could be made from materials available anywhere in the desert, and so requiring in its use that generations of Fremen had developed an entire body of knowledge about where and when and how to use it safely. He learned to plant the thumper, and to read the signs of the worm's approach, and to wait in the specific patience that the desert required. Not the patience of someone who had nothing to do, but the patience of someone who understood that the timing was everything, and that premature action was as bad as no action at all. He learned to ride the worm. This is the moment that the mythology attached itself to most completely, and the mythology is not wrong to find it significant. Worm riding was the Fremen rite of passage, the demonstration that you were equal to the desert's most dangerous element, that you could impose your will on something that could easily kill you, that you had the specific courage and capability and presence of mind that surviving on Arrakis at its deepest level required. The maker hooks that allowed the rider to control the worm by preventing it from rolling, to turn it by selective application of the hook's edges, to ride at speeds that could cover desert territory faster than any vehicle and leave no tracks that a conventional pursuit could follow. These were technologies and techniques that the Fremen had developed over generations, refined through the kind of selection process that only death as consequence could produce. Paul rode his first worm and did not die. He rode it and felt the specific quality of what it meant to be Fremen at the moment of maximum exposure to the desert's demands, not surviving despite the desert, but existing inside it, moving with it rather than against it, using what the desert was rather than fighting what the desert was. The guerrilla war against the Harkonnen spice operations began shortly after his integration into the sietch. Paul was not its architect. The Fremen had been fighting this war for decades before he arrived. And what he brought was not the idea of resistance, but specific tactical capabilities, and, more importantly, the Bene Gesserit combat disciplines, the Weirding Way, the specific application of prana bindu body mastery to fighting in ways that the Fremen fighters had never encountered. The Weirding Way was not magic, it was the specific application of prana bindu training, the Bene Gesserit techniques of precise body control, to combat. The practitioner moved with a speed and economy and precision that came from total integration of the body's capabilities, from the specific discipline of someone who had been training those capabilities since childhood. When Paul began teaching these techniques to Fremen fighters who were already exceptional, the result was something that the Harkonnen military reports from this period struggled to describe accurately, because what was happening on the ground did not correspond to any military doctrine the Harkonnens had encountered. Fremen fighters who had already been extraordinarily effective were becoming something else. The Weirding Way gave them tools for combat at ranges and speeds and with specific psychological effects that the conventional desert guerrilla tactics had not had. The combination of Fremen desert knowledge and Paul's Bene Gesserit training produced a military force that was, within a relatively short period, causing disruptions to the Harkonnen spice operations at a scale that the official reports were beginning to be unable to disguise. Jessica's transformation was occurring in parallel with Paul's. The Fremen Reverend Mother, the woman who held the religious authority over the sietches' spiritual life, who conducted the spice trance ceremonies, who was the keeper of the community's access to the ancestral memory, had died, and Jessica was being asked to take the role. The request was also a test. What the Fremen were asking Jessica to do was drink the water of life, the bile of a drowned sandworm, the substance that killed anyone who drank it, unless they could transform it biologically in the way that the Bene Gesserit spice agony required. Jessica knew the technique. She had the training, the specific Bene Gesserit knowledge of how the transformation worked and what it demanded of the body. But she had never actually undergone the spice agony. This would be the first time, attempted without the controlled conditions and preparation the sisterhood normally required, while carrying a child. What she had not done was drink the water of life while pregnant. Elia was born in the sietch. This is not primarily a biological fact about a birth. It is the origin of one of the most significant presences in the saga, and it begins with Jessica's decision to take the water of life when she was still carrying her daughter. The water of life transformed Jessica. It also, through the specific biological channels of pregnancy, transformed Elia before Elia was born. Elia came into the world with other memory already active, already carrying the accumulated consciousness of her female ancestors, already possessing the full scope of what a Reverend Mother had access to, without having the developmental experience that normally preceded and contextualized that access. The Bene Gesserit called this condition abomination. The term was harsh, but not inaccurate to their framework. A preborn child, exposed to other memory before their own selfhood had formed sufficiently to maintain its integrity against the pressure of all those other selves, was considered to be in a condition of fundamental instability, potentially capable of being taken over by one of the ancestral personalities that now had access to a psyche. That hadn't been fully formed yet. The danger was real. The Bene Gesserit's fear of the preborn was grounded in genuine documented history of what happened when the condition was not managed correctly. But Elia was also extraordinary in ways that the abomination label didn't fully capture. She knew things no child should know. She moved with a certainty that was eerie in a toddler, because it was not a toddler's certainty, It was the certainty of someone who had been through everything the ancestral record contained, who had the benefit of countless lifetimes of human experience, organized in a consciousness that was, in its present form, small enough to fit in a young child's body. She would, at the battle for Arrakis, kill Baron Vladimir Harkonnen with a Gom Jabbar, the Bene Gesserit's specific poisoned needle, the instrument of the test Paul himself had faced years before. She was barely 4 years old. She would do it because she understood exactly what she was doing and why, and because her capabilities were not, in any dimension that mattered, those of a child. The desert was producing things that the Imperium had no categories for. The 2 years of desert warfare, of Paul's growing authority in the sietches, of Jessica's establishment as Reverend Mother, of Aaliyah's strange and complete presence. These were years in which the probability space that Paul's prescience showed him was narrowing toward the event that he both needed and dreaded. The vision showed him the jihad. It had shown him this since the beginning, since the first clear prescient experience he had had after his spice consumption deepened on Arrakis. Billions of deaths. His name as a war cry. The Fremen armies moving through the Imperium in his name, carrying the specific violence that happens when deeply committed religious fighters encounter populations that have no defense against them. He searched the probability space constantly for paths that avoided this. He found none that led to outcomes he could accept. The paths that avoided the jihad led to worse jihads, led to outcomes in which the Fremen were destroyed. The Harkonnen power consolidated, the Imperium fossilized into the specific configuration of stasis that his later understanding would recognize as the real existential threat to humanity. He chose, in the end, to move toward what he could see coming, rather than away from it, because moving toward it at least gave him the possibility of shaping it. He chose to become the Mahdi, to accept the prophetic role, to use what the Missionaria Protectiva had prepared, rather than trying to dismantle it. He did this with full knowledge of what he was choosing. This is important about the Fremen and Paul's relationship with them. He did not deceive them. He did not take advantage of innocent people who deserved better than to have their faith weaponized. The Fremen were not credulous victims of a clever manipulation. They were sophisticated practitioners of a tradition that had, as they understood it, been preparing them for this for generations. The prophecy was installed by the Bene Gesserit, yes, but the Fremen had been living with it for long enough that it was genuinely theirs. The faith was genuinely their faith. The hope was genuinely their hope. What Paul gave them was not the false fulfillment of a manufactured prophecy. He gave them a real capability, the weirding way, the specific military techniques that made them even more dangerous than they already were, combined with a real vision. The ecological transformation that Kynes had begun, and that Paul now committed to in a way that made it not just a generational project, but an immediate priority. The kind of priority that a person with control of the Imperium could actually resource, rather than the kind of priority that a marginalized desert people could only advance slowly against the resistance of every power in the universe. The water at the bottom of the sietches was the Fremen's investment in the dream. The accumulated liters, the counted drops, the generations of careful hoarding. When Paul eventually took control of Arrakis, one of the first things he understood was the scale of what the Fremen had been building. Millions of decaliters of water, hidden in cisterns beneath the desert, waiting for the day when the ecological program would need the water to make the next phase work. The scale of it was staggering even to someone who knew it was there. The patience that had produced it was something he could appreciate theoretically and not entirely comprehend at the gut level, because he had not been born to it. The battle for Arrakis came with a Coriolis storm. the shield wall, the mountain range that protected the northern basin of Arrakis from the full force of the planet's Coriolis weather systems, had always been the geological fact that made the inhabited portions of the planet possible. Without the shield wall, the storm systems that built across the open desert would have made Arrakeen uninhabitable. The wall was not a structure that humans had built. It was a geological accident that humans had been using as shelter for as long as humans had been on Arrakis. Paul used atomics to breach it. The choice to use atomics against the shield wall rather than against human targets was legally significant. The Great Convention that governed warfare in the Imperium prohibited the use of atomics against human beings, but said nothing about geological formations. The distinction was both real and somewhat absurd, in the way that legal distinctions sometimes are when they are made in contexts very different from the one they are applied in. The point was not the legality, the point was what the breach made possible. Through the gap in the shield wall came the Coriolis storm that had been building beyond it, and on the storm came the worms, called by thumpers that the Fremen had placed at specific points in the desert, and on the worms came the Fremen army in the most dramatic military deployment in the history of the Imperium. Sandworm cavalry. The phrase barely captures what it was. The creatures that the Fremen called shy hulud, that could swallow a spice harvester whole, that moved through the sand at speeds that no conventional vehicle could match over rough desert terrain, that were essentially immune to any conventional weapon because their size and their specific biology made conventional weapons essentially irrelevant. These were now carrying Fremen fighters at full military speed into an imperial position that had been designed to defend against conventional assault. The Sardaukar, the Emperor's elite forces who had been deployed to Arrakis for the specific purpose of ending the Fremen threat, were among the finest fighters the Imperium had ever produced. They were selected through a process that killed most of the people who went through it and produced, in those who survived, fighters of extraordinary quality. They had never faced anything like what came through the breach in the shield wall, with the Coriolis storm behind it and the Fremen riders on worm back ahead of it. The battle was decisive in the way that battles are decisive, when one side has an overwhelming advantage in terrain, motivation, preparation, and knowledge. The Fremen knew this desert in a way that no Sardaukar could know it in the time available. The Fremen were fighting for everything that mattered to them. The Fremen had been training for this, in one sense, since they first arrived on Arrakis thousands of years ago. And the Fremen had, in Paul Muad'Dib, a commander with prescient capacity that turned tactical decisions into something approaching strategic prophecy. The Emperor capitulated. The Harkonnens, without the Baron who had died in the battle at Alia's hands, had no coherent response. The Spacing Guild, whose navigational monopoly depended entirely on the continued flow of the spice that Paul now controlled, backed down from any position that would have meant opposing him. House Atreides, which Paul now claimed in its new form. The form of an interstellar power rather than a planetary noble house, took Arrakis, and with Arrakis the political control of the known universe. The Fremen had won. But winning turned out to be its own kind of difficulty. The jihad that Paul had seen in his visions happened. This is the thing that the mythology around Paul Muad'Dib consistently struggled with, and that the Fremen's own relationship with their history of this period reflected. They had won what they wanted, and what followed was not simply the green world that the terraforming program had promised. The Fremen armies moved through the Imperium. 90 planets were scarred. 61 billion people died. The specific combination of Fremen military capability and religious conviction and Paul's prescient guidance produced a military force that was genuinely unstoppable in the conditions of the early jihad, before the resistance organized itself and before the specific circumstances of the campaign changed in ways that could be exploited. This was not what the terraforming program had been building toward. This was not what Pardot Kynes had envisioned when he calculated the 3 to 5 century timeline of desert transformation. This was not what the water counts in the sietch cisterns had been accumulated for. The dream of green Arrakis had been a dream of patience, of incremental change, of the specific slow work of ecological transformation. The jihad was something else entirely. Fast, violent, consuming, transforming the Fremen from a desert people into an interstellar military force in a way that changed their relationship with themselves and with what they were for. The transformation of the Fremen in the jihad period is one of the most important and least examined aspects of the Dune saga's treatment of them. The Fremen who came back from the jihad were not the Fremen who had gone into it. They had fought across dozens of worlds. They had encountered people and places and cultures that the sietches of Arrakis had not prepared them for. They had been in many ways taken out of the desert, the specific environment that had shaped them so completely, and placed in very different contexts where their specific desert disciplines were not always the right tools. Some of them lost the desert. This sounds like a metaphor, but it is also a literal observation. There were Fremen who, after years fighting on other worlds, had lost the specific edge of desert awareness that the sietches maintained. The sandwalk was not habitual to them anymore. The water discipline had been disrupted by campaigns fought in environments where water was not scarce. The specific knowledge of Arrakis, the wind patterns, the worm migration routes, the subtle signs in the sand that told an experienced reader what was happening beneath the surface. This knowledge required the desert to maintain, and some of the jihad fighters had been away from the desert long enough that it was beginning to fade. Paul saw this, and it was among the things that troubled him about what the jihad was producing. The Fremen had been extraordinary because they had been shaped by Arrakis. The jihad was taking them off Arrakis. What were the Fremen without the desert that made them what they were? The terraforming continued. This is crucial and often overlooked in accounts of the Paul Muad'Dib period, even as the jihad consumed the political energy of the Imperium, even as the Fremen armies were deployed across worlds that were not Arrakis. The ecological program that Kynes had started and that Paul had committed to continued. The wind traps kept running. The plant cultures that had been established in the sheltered areas kept growing. The water counts in the sietch cisterns continued to increase. The northern polar regions of Arrakis were beginning, visibly, to change. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have satisfied anyone who wanted quick results, but measurably. The water was there, accumulating in places where it hadn't been before, creating the marginal conditions in which certain kinds of pioneer vegetation could establish themselves, and the pioneer vegetation creating the conditions in which the next stage could begin. The Fremen ecological workers, the people who had been maintaining the terraforming program across the generations since Kynes had begun it, the ones who understood what they were doing, not just as religious obligation, but as technical project, were the unsung heroes of this period. They kept working while the armies moved, and the politics shifted, and the mythology around Muad'Dib developed in directions that its central figure found increasingly uncomfortable. They kept planting and measuring and building and waiting, because that was what the dream required, and the dream had survived everything else it had been required to survive. The specific tension between the terraforming dream and the Fremen military identity would become one of the defining themes of the post-jihad period. The The Fremen had always been two things simultaneously: the desert people who maintained the water discipline and the ecological program, and the warriors who had resisted the Harkonnen occupation and would resist any comparable oppression. The jihad had amplified the warrior identity enormously, and had potentially, in some of the Fremen who had spent years off-planet, begun to erode the desert identity that the warrior identity had grown from. This was not a crisis yet. It would become one in the Children of Dune period, when the terraforming success began to compete with the worm ecology in ways that created the specific political and ecological crisis that Leto II would have to resolve. But in the Paul period, it was a tension rather than a conflict, something visible to those who were paying attention, something that the prescient faculty could project into futures that were genuinely concerning, but not yet the thing that would eventually require the most radical possible response. Elia governed the Fremen in Paul's absence, and in the period of his metaphorical absence, the period when the Emperor Muad'Dib was becoming increasingly inaccessible to ordinary human contact. Increasingly imprisoned by his own prescient faculty, increasingly unable to be in the present moment in the way that leadership requires. She governed with the capabilities of a pre-born Reverend Mother in a young woman's body, which meant she governed with extraordinary capability and the specific vulnerability that the preborn condition carried. The Fremen relationship with Elia was complicated. She was Muad'Dib's sister and the daughter of the Reverend Mother Jessica, which placed her in the Fremen's sacred hierarchy at a level that most Fremen accepted without fully understanding what they were accepting. She was also visibly something that no previous Fremen tradition had encountered, a being who had the full power of the Bene Gesserit other memory combined with the direct access to the desert tradition that her Fremen upbringing had given her, in a person who had never gone through the ordinary developmental stages that produced a stable human identity. The Fremen who interacted with Elia regularly developed a specific kind of unease around her that they expressed, typically in the Fremen way, by working around her rather than confronting her directly, by maintaining the traditional respect while quietly developing other channels for the things that the respect would have routed through her. This was not rebellion. This was the Fremen practice of pragmatic adaptation, the same quality that had made them survive everything else they had survived. Paul's death, walk into the desert, the tradition of the blind man who could no longer fulfill the obligations that desert survival required, the custom that took the Fremen's most specific discipline and applied it to their leader at the moment when his leader's power was at its most absolute, was one of the most significant events in Fremen history, and the Fremen relationship with it was characteristically complex. He was blind. The stone burner had taken his eyes, but his prescient faculty was intact, which meant that Paul Muad'Dib continued to see, to navigate, to exist in relationship with the desert, in a way that was not quite what ordinary Fremen life required, but was also not exactly what the tradition of the blind man's death walk described. He walked into the desert and did not die, or did not die in any way that anyone could confirm. He disappeared into the desert. The Fremen said he was out there. They said a blind man could still walk in the desert if his other faculties were sufficient, and that a man with Paul's prescient faculty had faculties that were more than sufficient. They built a mythology around his continued existence that served the same function that all living saint mythologies serve, maintaining the connection between the community and the figure who embodied its most fundamental aspirations, even when the figure was no longer physically present and verifiably alive. They also built a practical governance structure that acknowledged his absence. The sietches continued to function. The water counts continued to be maintained. The terraforming program continued. The Fremen were not a people who let the absence of a leader dissolve the structures that held their communities together, because the structures had been built to survive the desert, and the desert was more reliably harsh than any political situation. The children of Dune period brought the Fremen face to face with a form of success that they had not fully prepared for. The desert was actually changing. Not dramatically, not in ways that were obvious to anyone who hadn't been measuring carefully for decades. But the ecological program was working. The moisture levels in the sheltered areas of the northern basin were measurably higher than they had been 2 generations earlier. Plant cover was expanding. The specific pioneer ecosystem that the terraforming program had been designed to establish was establishing itself. The water that the wind traps had been collecting for decades was beginning to accumulate in places where it could be used by something other than just the sietch cisterns. The sandworms were retreating. This was the complication that the terraforming program had always contained, and that the program's designers had always known about and had never quite figured out how to prevent. The sandworm ecology required extreme aridity, the specific conditions that produced melange, the pre-spice masses that formed when the spice blows were triggered, the life cycle that moved from sand trout to worm and back again, depended on the desert remaining desert. As the terraforming program succeeded in introducing moisture to previously arid areas, those areas became less suitable for the sandworm ecology, and the sandworms moved to where the desert was still dry. The spice production was declining. This was an ecological and economic and political crisis simultaneously. Ecologically, because the sandworm life cycle was the foundational biology of Arrakis' unique ecosystem, and disrupting it had consequences that no one fully understood. Economically, because the spice was the currency on which the entire Imperium's economy was based. Politically, because the Fremen's identity and legitimacy as the planet's primary people was deeply tied to their relationship with Shai-Hulud, and Shai-Hulud was moving away from the areas where the Fremen were most established. Leto II and Ganima, Paul's children, preborn like Elia, carrying the specific burden and capability of the preborn condition, looked at this situation with the clarity that prescient vision and Bene Gesserit training gave them, and understood that the crisis was real, and that the response to it was going to have to be more radical than anything their father's rule had contemplated. The Fremen were divided about what to do. Some of them, the conservatives, in Fremen political terms, the people whose identity was most completely tied to the traditional desert life, resisted the terraforming's progress, wanted to reverse it, wanted to protect the sandworm ecology above the green dream. They were not wrong that the sandworm ecology was precious. They were not wrong that the spice was important, but they were, in Leto II's assessment, missing the larger picture. The ecological crisis was not a problem to be solved by choosing one value over another. It required something altogether more drastic. What Leto II did with the sand trout, and what that transformation meant for the Fremen, for the planet, for the spice ecology, for the future of humanity, is one of the most extreme things in the Dune saga, and represents the endpoint of the Fremen story in a form that Paul Atreides, who had started the terraforming program, could not have imagined. The God Emperor was not Fremen. He had been born Fremen, had grown up Fremen, had learned the sandwalk and the crusk knife and the worm riding from the same tradition that had produced everything distinctive about the Fremen people. But what he became, when he allowed the sand trout to envelope him and initiated the biological merger that would eventually consume his humanity over 3,500 years. This was not Fremen in any sense the sietches could have recognized, and yet the sietches remained. The Fremen identity persisted in a form more attenuated and more institutional than the living desert tradition had been across the millennia of the god Emperor's reign. The fish speakers, Leto II's all-female army, were not Fremen exactly, but they drew on Fremen fighting traditions and Fremen organizational principles and the specific quality of discipline that the Fremen origin had seeded into the Arrakeen population more broadly. The desert was preserved. This is the most important thing Leto II did for the Fremen. Ecologically speaking, he stopped the terraforming. The green zone in the north, the polar regions where the moisture had begun to accumulate, where the plant cover was establishing itself, continued, because Leto II decided it should continue, because it served purposes in his long planning that we will not detail here. But the deep desert, the erg that was the sandworms' domain and had been the Fremen's home, was protected. The sandworms remained. The spice continued to flow under Leto II's management. The ecology that had shaped the Fremen and that the Fremen had built their entire culture around continued to exist, kept alive by the being who had emerged from that culture and then transcended it in ways that the culture had never imagined. After Leto II's death, the design death that was the final act of the Golden Path, the desert came back to the areas that had been greened. The sandworms returned. The Fremen, in the 1500 years between Leto II's death and the events of Heretics of Dune, had time to reconstitute their relationship with the planet in forms that were both continuous with the old tradition and significantly changed by everything that had happened. The Fremen of the Heretics period were not the Fremen of Paul Muad'Dib's time. 1500 years had passed. The ecological program had run its course, been arrested by Leto II, partially reversed by his death, and then re-established in a modified form. The sietches existed, but the cities also existed, and the Fremen identity had blurred in ways that the original sietches would have found alarming. The blue within blue eyes were rarer now. The spice saturation that had produced them still existed, but the spice was less uniformly distributed. And the Fremen who lived in the cities rather than the deep desert did not have the same saturation levels that their ancestors had had. And the sandworms on Arrakis, for the world had been renamed from Arrakis to Arrakis in one of those small name changes that carried enormous cultural weight, were different. They were smaller than the ancient makers had been, subtly changed by the millennia of the God Emperor's influence. They were still shai-hulud. They still made the spice. They still demanded the respect that the desert demanded and the desert god demanded, and that the Fremen had always given. But the Fremen relationship with them was more mediated, more institutional, filtered through the religious bureaucracy of the divided god. The faith that had grown up around Leto II's memory and his death, and the specific theology of a god who had chosen to become something other than human in service of humanity. Then Arrakis burned. The honoured matres, the women who had come back from the scattering, changed by whatever they had encountered in the dark beyond the Imperium's edges, carrying a violence that was specifically designed to eliminate anything they regarded as a threat, obliterated Arrakis. The sandworms died. The spice ecology that had made Arrakis the centre of the universe for 10,000 years was destroyed in hours. The Bene Gesserit had anticipated this, partially. The sandworm that Shiena had tamed, the Fremen girl who could call worms, whose relationship with shai-hulud recalled the oldest desert traditions, was preserved. One worm survived. And on Chapter House, the Bene Gesserit began the slow process of creating a new desert, restarting the sandworm ecology on a new world. The Fremen as a specific people with a continuous culture from Poratrin to Arrakis, that story ended when Arrakis burned. What continued was the biology, and the biology carried the possibility of new Fremen. Whoever lived on the new desert world long enough would develop blue eyes, would learn the sandwalk to survive, would count water and develop the specific relationship with the desert that the desert demanded of those who lived in it. The desert makes the Fremen. It always has. What do we make of the Fremen at the end of this very long story? They were the product of the most extreme environment in the inhabited universe, shaped by it so completely that the shaping was invisible to them, not something they had chosen to become, but simply what they were. What 10,000 years of desert existence had made of human beings who refused to die. They were the product of a specific religious tradition that had developed across millennia of wandering and slavery, that had preserved itself through exactly the kind of patient, internally maintained practice that the desert would later demand of them. They were the product of a terraforming vision that had been running for generations before anyone in the Imperium knew it existed, funded by the accumulated sacrifice of countless individuals who would never live to see its completion. They were not simple people. The impulse to romanticize the Fremen, to make them either the noble savages of a desert paradise or the ruthless killing machines of a military narrative, misses what they actually were. They were complex people with a complete civilization, a rich religious tradition, sophisticated political structures, genuine aesthetics. The Fremen poetry was specific and beautiful, deep emotional lives that the water economy shaped rather than suppressed, and a long history that predated Arrakis and would outlast any single empire. They were also people who counted their dead by the water returned. This is the thing that sounds harsh and is actually tender when you understand it. The death still was not the denial of grief. It was grief expressed in the only currency that the desert recognized, in the substance that the body held and the community needed, in the final acknowledgement that what a person was, in the Fremen framework, was always already part of the community's survival. The water was the love, made concrete and practical and permanent. The Fremen chose Paul Atreides in the end not because the prophecy told them to, though the prophecy prepared them to be able to make that choice. They chose him because he was willing to become one of them in the ways that mattered, because he learned the sandwalk and earned the Kruzk knife and wept water over the man he killed, and took the name the desert gave him rather than the name his bloodline had given him. They chose him because the desert, which judged everything by survival, found him capable. That judgment was always the Fremen's most important judgment. The desert does not care about politics or prophecy or the elaborate social machinery of the Imperium. The desert cares about one thing: can you survive here? The Fremen had built their entire civilization around answering that question correctly, generation after generation, with the specific form of excellence that correct answers, sustained across thousands of years, produced. They were the people who survived Arrakis. In a universe full of remarkable peoples and remarkable civilizations, this is perhaps the simplest and most complete thing that can be said about them. They survived Arrakis. And in surviving it, they became something that the universe had never contained before and would never entirely contain again: the people of the desert god, the water counters. The dreamers of the green world, the riders of Shai Hulud, the makers of the Muad'Dib, the fighters who came through the Coriolis storm on the backs of creatures that the universe had no other name for, who changed the Imperium and were changed by it, and who remained, in the most essential sense, always and completely themselves. The spice is still in the blood of anyone who has lived long enough in the desert. The eyes are still blue. The sandwalk is still how you move when you want to live. The desert remembers. The sietch was not simply a survival structure. It was a complete world. The cave systems that the Fremen carved into the rock over generations had, by the time the Atreides arrived on Arrakis, been expanded and furnished and decorated in ways that reflected a people who had moved well beyond the minimum requirements of survival into the specifically human territory of wanting their world to be beautiful as well as functional. The Fremen had poetry. This is not a trivial thing to note. Poetry is the art form that requires the least material and the most discipline, that can exist in the most minimal conditions, that is most completely portable and most completely internal. A people who have been wandering for thousands of years and who never know when they will have to move again cannot build cathedrals. They can develop poetry. The Fremen did, and it was good. The water imagery in Fremen poetry was not what you might expect from a people living in extremity. It was not uniformly elegiac, not simply a lament for the water they didn't have. It was more complex than that. Water was the measure of value, the scale on which all costs were weighed. And so Fremen poetry used water imagery the way other poetic traditions use monetary imagery, or the imagery of light and darkness, as the fundamental reference point from which all other values were calculated. When a Fremen poet said that someone's love was worth crying over, the calculation was literal, and the literal meaning was deeply emotional. Real water. Real love. The equation was not metaphorical. It was the form that Fremen emotion took when it was expressed with maximum precision. The music existed too, though the forms it took were necessarily constrained by what the desert permitted. The Fremen tonal music, the specific scales and rhythms that had developed in the sietches over centuries, was adapted to underground performance, to the acoustic properties of carved rock chambers, to the limitations of instruments that could be maintained and repaired without access to specialized manufacturing. It was also adapted to its function. Fremen music was primarily communal music, music that brought the sietch together, rather than music that performed for an audience. The distinction matters. Communal music is different in its purposes and its forms from performance music. It is the music that does something, that creates the specific social bonding that communities require, that marks the occasions that need marking without requiring a specialized musician class to mark them. The Fremen had specialized musicians anyway, in the specific sense that some people had greater musical gifts than others and were known for them. But the music was not separated from ordinary life in the way that the Imperium's performance arts traditions were separated from ordinary life. Music in the sietch was what happened when the sietch needed it. The naib was the political and military leader of the sietch. The title was earned rather than inherited, and the mechanism of earning was the specific combination of demonstrated capability and community trust that the desert's demands made reliable as a selection mechanism. A naib who was not capable would fail in ways that were immediately obvious and consequential. A naib who was capable but did not have the community's genuine trust. Not the fear-based compliance that power without trust produced, but the genuine trust that came from people believing that their leader's judgment was reliable and their leader's concern for the community was genuine. Such a naib would find the sietch's cooperation withdrawn in ways that were quiet and practical rather than dramatic, because the Fremen did not waste energy on drama. Stilgar was the naib of Sietch Tabr, and Stilgar is perhaps the most complete portrait of what a naib actually was, not in any idealized sense, not as a perfect leader, but as a man doing an extraordinarily difficult job with the specific set of tools and limitations that Fremen culture provided. He was physically capable. The years in the desert had produced a man whose body was as completely adapted to desert demands as decades of such demands could make a body. He was politically intelligent, the specific kind of intelligence that desert survival cultivated, attentive to every signal, capable of reading people and situations with the rapid efficiency that situations where misreading had fatal consequences produced. He cared about his people in the way that leaders care about people when their leadership is not abstract management but constant direct responsibility for whether those people survive. He was also a man of his tradition, which meant he carried assumptions and frameworks that were sometimes wrong and sometimes right and always genuinely his, rather than adopted for convenience. He believed in the prophecy not because he was credulous, but because the prophecy had been part of his tradition since before he was born and had been fulfilled in ways that his tradition had prepared him to recognize as fulfillment. His belief was genuine. His intelligence operated within it rather than around it. His relationship with Paul Muad'Dib was one of the most important relationships in the history of the Fremen Atreides interaction, and it was complicated in ways that the mythology around Paul tended to flatten. Stilgar was not simply a follower. He was someone who had assessed Paul as an Abe assesses anyone who is claiming a place in the community, who had found him capable, who had granted him a place and then continued to assess him as his capabilities developed. The relationship retained elements of this ongoing assessment even as Paul's role grew beyond anything that the Nabe to new member dynamic was designed to accommodate. There was a moment in the period of the Desert War when Stilgar understood that tribal law would require him to challenge Paul for leadership of the Fremen, because Paul had grown powerful enough that the challenge was the logical next step in the Fremen tradition of confirming leadership through demonstrated capability. He also understood that making the challenge would mean his death, because Paul was now capable of killing him as certainly as Paul had killed Jameis. And he chose not to make the challenge, chose to continue in his position as Naib of Sietch Tabba under Paul's larger authority, in a way that wasn't entirely a violation of the tradition, but was also not entirely consistent with it. This is the Fremen political tradition encountering something it hadn't been designed for, a leader who was beyond the community's ability to assess through the traditional mechanisms, who had grown into something that exceeded the categories the tradition provided. The tradition's response, Stilgar's response, was characteristically Fremen, pragmatic, patient, finding the accommodation that allowed the community to continue functioning rather than insisting on the form of the tradition at the cost of the substance. The Sayadina held a position in the Sietch that was parallel to the Naib's and in some ways equally important, where the Naib managed the Sietch's relationship with the physical world, its military security, its resource allocation. Its relationships with other sietches, the Sayadina managed its relationship with the sacred, not separately from the physical world, because in the Fremen framework the sacred and the physical were not cleanly separable, but as the specific aspect of the community's existence that concerned itself with meaning, with the divine, with the question of what all the survival was for. The Sayadina's training was long and specific. It began in childhood, and it centered on the spice, on developing the specific relationship with melange that would eventually allow the candidate to undergo the spice trance, to access the states of consciousness that the trance made available, and potentially to survive the water of life ordeal that transformed a candidate into a Reverend Mother. Not every Sayadina survived the ordeal. The ones who did gained access to collective memory and to the specific authority that the community's tradition placed on those who had made that passage. The Sayadina tradition was also the primary vehicle through which the Missionaria Protectiva's installed mythology was maintained in the Fremen community. The religious practitioner who was responsible for keeping the tradition alive was also the person through whose hands the manufactured elements of that tradition passed, season by season and generation by generation. The Sayadinas did not know that the Lisan al-Gaib prophecy had been installed by an outside institution rather than arising organically from their own spiritual development. From inside the tradition, it was their tradition, as authentic and as deep as everything else they maintained. This is what made Jessica's acceptance as a Reverend Mother so significant from the Fremen's perspective and so complicated from her own. She knew what the prophecy was and where it had come from. She knew that she was activating a system that the Bene Gesserit had designed using knowledge that the Bene Gesserit had given her. To protect herself and her son in a way that the Bene Gesserit had prepared for. And she also underwent a genuine ordeal, the water of life transformation that she experienced without the preparation the Bene Gesserit normally required, while pregnant with Elia, that was not manufactured or performed, but was as real as anything the Fremen tradition described. The combination gave her a genuinely mixed relationship to the tradition she was entering. She was using it, yes. She was also, in a meaningful sense, becoming part of it. She gained the other memory, the accumulated consciousness of the female ancestors that the ordeal unlocked, and with it a depth of experience that couldn't be dismissed as simply the exploitation of a useful institutional position. She became what the tradition said she was, even if the tradition had been prepared by people who had other intentions. The specific relationship between the Fremen and the sandworms deserves more careful examination than it usually receives, because it was neither simple reverence nor instrumental use, but something more complex that the available categories don't quite capture. The worms were sacred. Shai Hulud, the Old Man of the Desert, the Maker, these were religious titles, genuinely applied by people for whom the religious dimension of existence was not separable from the practical one. The worms made the spice, and the spice was in the Fremen's blood and consciousness in ways that off-worlders' spice use, however heavy, couldn't replicate. The relationship was metabolic, not just cultural. The Fremen body had been processing spice continuously since birth and had adapted to it in ways that made the relationship between Fremen biology and worm biology genuinely reciprocal. The worm produced the compound that was in the Fremen blood, and the Fremen blood was shaped by the compound, and the compound was in everything the Fremen ate and breathed and touched. But the worms were also tools in the specific sense that the desert required. They were transportation, they were military assets, they were the most effective way to move large numbers of people across the deep desert at speed, and the Fremen who could ride them with skill were among the most mobile military force in the known universe. The instrumentality was real, and the Fremen did not pretend otherwise. You called the worm, you mounted it, you directed it where you needed to go, and you treated it with the care that you gave something that could kill you if your attention lapsed. Because it could. The religion and the instrumentality coexisted without paradox in the Fremen framework, because the Fremen framework did not separate the sacred from the functional in the way that some religious traditions did. Shai Hulud was sacred, and you rode Shai Hulud when you needed to ride Shai Hulud. The riding was not desecration. The riding was participation, a specific physical form of participation in the reality that Shai Hulud represented. The reality of the desert's power and the desert's demands and the desert's specific terms for the relationship it permitted with those who lived in it. The thumper was the instrument for calling the worm. The maker hooks were the instrument for riding it. The sandwalk was the practice that made it possible to be in the open desert without drawing unwanted worm attention. All of these technologies were also in the Fremen framework, religious objects or religious practices, not because the Fremen were confused about what they were doing, but because the Fremen didn't recognize the distinction between the religious and the functional as a distinction that reality supported. The prayer before calling a worm was not separate from the technical preparation of the thumper. The prayer was part of the preparation, part of the process of ensuring that you were in the right state of attention and intention and awareness to do the thing correctly. The Fremen had found, through however many centuries of observation and trial and error that produced the maker hook technology, that the right state of mind was part of the right technique. The prayer was the technology for getting into the right state of mind. The technology and the prayer were the same thing. The Fremen relationship with death deserves the same careful attention. The death still was the most obvious expression of this relationship, but it was not the only one. The Fremen had a specific concept, tazir, the ceremony of mourning, that was conducted over the water recovered from the dead. This was not a burial. The body was not buried, it was processed. The tazir was conducted over what remained after the processing, the water measured and counted, and the dry residue that the death still left behind. The dry residue was mixed into the taffa jars, the community containers that held the material record of all the community's dead, and the taffa jars were maintained in specific places of honor in the sietch. The water was added to the sietch's reserves. The dry residue was kept. Both were honored. The water was honored by being used, by being added to the community's survival, and thus becoming part of every future drink and every future life that the community sustained. The dry residue was honored by being kept, by being maintained in the taffa jars as a physical presence, a material acknowledgement that the person had existed and that their existence had left a trace that the community chose to preserve. Fremen grief was water measured in the specific sense that tears were the most precious form of grief. This has been noted, but the full depth of what it meant is worth exploring. A person who did not cry at a death was not dishonoring the dead. The Fremen understood that some people did not cry easily, that the mechanism was variable across individuals, but a person who did cry was understood to be paying the highest possible tribute, spending from their own body's moisture, the thing that survival made precious, the thing that the desert made precious, in acknowledgement of the specific irreplaceable loss that this death represented. Paul's tears over Jameis, actual tears, real moisture, the body's genuine grief response, were the thing that made the Fremen take him seriously. Not his combat skill, which was obvious, but was not remarkable given what he was. Not his relationship to the prophecy, which required interpretation. The tears. The willingness to spend water on grief for someone who had been trying to kill him. This was not a performance that a skilled manipulator could have managed on demand. This was a genuine response, and the Fremen, who had spent generations developing the ability to read genuine responses, because genuine responses were the only reliable data the desert provided, read it correctly. The Fremen dead were present in the taffa jars. Not as spirits, the Fremen afterlife theology was not organized around personal spiritual continuity in the way that many religious traditions were. The dead were present in the specific sense that the material record of them was maintained, that the community chose to keep what remained of them close rather than releasing it entirely. that the relationship between the living and the dead was not severed by the death still, but was transformed into a different kind of relationship, one mediated by the dry residue in the jar and the water distributed through the community's bloodstream. This is the Fremen religious imagination at its most specific and most characteristic, material, physical, refusing the clean separation of the sacred from the stuff of ordinary life, finding the divine in the actual rather than in an abstraction from the actual. The dead were in the jars, the dead were also in the water. Both were true, both were honoured. The question of Fremen political organisation at the level above the individual sietch is one that the casual observer might assume was simple. A loose confederation of desert communities united by common culture and common cause, and that turns out to be considerably more complex. The sietches were not identical to one another. They had developed over the generations of their independent existence specific characters, specific strengths and weaknesses, specific relationships with their particular sections of the desert, specific political cultures that reflected the specific histories of the people who had built them. Sietch Tabba, Stilgar's community, was known for its military excellence and for the specific quality of its fighters. Other sietches had different reputations for their water technology, for their knowledge of particular desert sectors, for the quality of their Sayadina tradition, for the specific character of their Naib. The Naib Council, the gathering of sietches leaders that addressed issues requiring coordination across communities, was the primary mechanism for cross-sietch governance, and it functioned in ways that reflected the Fremen political culture broadly, through the combination of demonstrated capability and the specific kind of trust that only genuine track record could build. With none of the formal institutional machinery that the Imperium used, and with all of the specific kinds of interpersonal assessment that the desert had made the Fremen expert at. The challenges were real. Sietches competed for territory, for water, for the specific desert knowledge that allowed a community to be positioned well relative to the worm migration routes and the spice blow patterns that determined how much melange a community could accumulate to trade with the guild. The competition was generally managed within cultural frameworks that made it productive rather than destructive. The tradition of the single combat as a dispute resolution mechanism, the specific codes of honor that governed inter-sietch interaction, the shared religious tradition that placed all the sietches within a community of meaning even when they were in conflict over material resources. But the competition existed. The Fremen were not uniformly cooperative. They were not a simple, unified, harmonious people. They were a complex people whose cooperative tendencies and competitive tendencies were both shaped by the desert's demands, both expressed in the specific ways that the desert's demands permitted. The Al-Asima, the Sayadina Council that addressed religious questions across sietches, provided a different kind of cross-community coordination, one based on the shared sacred tradition rather than on political authority. The Sayadinas of different sietches maintained relationships with one another that the Naibs did not always have, because the religious tradition created channels of communication that the political tradition didn't always open. The result was a kind of soft power, a capacity for influence that operated through the sacred rather than through the political, that was useful precisely because it was not subject to the same constraints that political authority faced. In times of genuine threat, the Harkonnen occupation being the most sustained example, this cross-sietch coordination became something more organized and more effective than the everyday confederation structure suggested. The Fremen could, when they needed to, function as a unified military force, with the sietches coordinating their guerrilla operations in ways that required real communication and real trust and real shared purpose. They could do this without the formal command structures that the Imperium's military operated within, because the desert had trained them to trust their own judgment and to coordinate through shared understanding rather than through explicit orders. Paul Atreides used this capacity and also reshaped it. His arrival and his acceptance as Muad'Dib gave the cross-sietch coordination a different centre, not the Naib Council, not the Al-Asima, but the person who had been accepted by the entire Fremen tradition as something more than a Naib, as the fulfillment of the tradition's most fundamental expectation. The sietches that had previously coordinated horizontally began to coordinate through Paul and through Paul's lieutenants in ways that created something more like a conventional military hierarchy. Not exactly that, because the Fremen would never accept the kind of command structure that could override their judgment and the judgment of their naibs. But something that functioned similarly for specific purposes. Chani's role in the Paul period deserves more careful examination than it usually receives, because the mythology around Muad'Dib tends to position her as a supporting character in a story that is primarily about him, which misrepresents both her and her importance. Chani was Liet Kynes' daughter. She was a Fremen woman of the deep desert, trained from childhood in everything the desert required. She was also a Sayadina in training, on the path toward the religious authority that her community maintained for its most capable women. She had grown up knowing the ecological vision that her father had dedicated his life to, understanding it not simply as a political or scientific program, but as the sacred calling that it was within the Fremen tradition. When she encountered Paul in the circumstances of his arrival at Sietch Tabr, she assessed him the way the Fremen assessed everything, by what he could do, by what he showed, by the specific quality of his attention and his movement and his response to what the desert asked of him. She was not swept off her feet by the prophecy. She was skeptical of the prophecy in the practical, pragmatic way that the most experienced Fremen tended to be skeptical of it, understanding what it was, what it could do, what it had been built to do, without being entirely captured by its imagery in the way that less experienced or less thoughtful members of the community might be. What she found in Paul was capability, the capability to do what the desert required, the capability to learn, which she found at least as important as the capability to perform, because the desert's demands changed, and a person who could only do what they already knew how to do was limited in ways that the desert punished. And gradually, as the months of desert work accumulated, something she found she couldn't categorize in purely practical terms, something that was not the prophecy's promise, and not simply the combat skill, and not simply the political intelligence, something that was Paul as a person rather than Paul as a function. She loved him. This is not a surprise and not a secret in the story. But the specific quality of her love, the form that it took, the way the Fremen emotional vocabulary and the Fremen relationship with intimacy shaped it, is worth examining. Fremen love was not the courtly love of the Imperium's romantic traditions, not the specifically performed emotion of people who had the luxury of performing emotions. It was the love of people who lived in genuine extremity, who knew that every person they loved might die tomorrow in a desert that killed people, who had learned to hold attachment with the specific quality of presence that the desert demanded of all its engagements. She gave him Fremen birthwater when their daughter was born. The specific ceremonial recognition of new life that the Fremen tradition maintained, the offering of the child's first breath's moisture to the community's reserves. She was the person he came back to when the visions were too much to hold alone, who could not see what he saw, but could be present with him in the holding of it. She was the Fremen anchor in a period when everything about Paul was moving away from the desert and toward the Imperium that the Desert War would eventually make him master of. Her death in childbirth, delivering the twins Leto and Genema while Paul was blind from the stone burner attack, was one of the specific catastrophes that broke the path Paul had been on and set him toward the desert walk. But her importance was not simply in what her death caused. Her importance was in what she was while she lived, the person who connected Paul to the Fremen most authentically, who was never simply a function in the mythological structure, but was always a specific person with her own knowledge and her own desert and her own very strong opinions about what was real. The political complexity of the post-jihad Fremen situation is something that the story's mythology tends to compress into a simple arc of triumph followed by decline, which misses the texture of what actually happened. The Fremen who went out as the jihad armies were changed by the going out. We have noted this, but the specific ways deserve more attention. They encountered other people's water. This sounds like a minor thing. It was not minor for people whose entire emotional relationship with water was structured around scarcity, whose deepest cultural values had been organized around the preciousness of moisture, who had developed an aesthetic around the specific quality of attention that the precious demanded. When Fremen fighters found themselves on water-rich worlds, operating in environments where rain fell from the sky and rivers ran in the open and water was simply background, when this happened, something in the Fremen cultural software was confronted with an experience it had not been designed to process. Some fighters adapted gracefully. Some did not adapt at all, maintained the water discipline, the counting, the same deference to moisture that Arrakis had taught them, in environments where the deference was not required, and looked to the people around them like either religious eccentricity or mental illness. Some adapted in the wrong direction, abandoned the water discipline along with other aspects of the desert identity, found in the abundance of water-rich worlds something that felt like freedom but was actually the loss of the framework that had made them who they were. The Fremen word for homesickness, for the specific grief of being away from the desert, was Layali, and it was a word that the jihad period produced more uses of than any previous period in Fremen history. The Layali was real. The Fremen were not a people who adapted easily to non-desert environments, not because they lacked the capability to adapt, but because the desert was so completely integrated into their identity that being away from it was not like moving from one climate to another. It was like being away from something that was part of yourself. The Fremen who came home from the jihad, those who came home, because many did not, many died on other worlds or chose to stay, or were simply lost in the vast dispersal of an interstellar military campaign, came home, changed. Some were changed in ways that enriched the sietches, bringing knowledge of other worlds and other cultures, and other ways of organizing human life that gave the Fremen community a broader context for itself. Some were changed in ways that the sietches found difficult to integrate, carrying trauma and disruption and the specific damage that sustained combat across multiple campaigns on unfamiliar terrain produced. The Naib councils of the post-jihad period dealt with these returns with a pragmatic patience that the Fremen always brought to human difficulty. The returned fighters were their people. The sietches found ways to receive them, slower in some cases, more careful, requiring more time and more specific accommodation than ordinary returns from desert operations. But receiving them. The children born in the post-jihad sietches were different from the children born before the jihad. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been obvious to an outside observer. But the community that produced them had been through something, and the something had left marks. The water discipline was maintained because the desert still demanded it and the sietch still required it. The sand walk was taught because the worms still moved through the sand. The crisp-knife ceremonies still happened. But the specific context in which they happened had changed. The community had a different relationship with the Imperium, with other peoples, with the universe beyond the desert, than the pre-jihad Fremen had had. Whether this was loss or growth or simply change was not a question the Fremen community spent a great deal of time asking, because the desert did not encourage dwelling on unanswerable questions. What could be adapted to, the Fremen adapted to. What required resistance, they resisted. What was simply the cost of what had happened, they paid. The ecological crisis of the Children of Dune period forced the Fremen to confront something that the terraforming dream had always contained, but had never made fully explicit: the tension between what they were and what they had always hoped to become. The Fremen had been dreaming of green Arrakis for generations. The dream was genuine. The work toward it was real. The sacrifice it had required was enormous. And the dream was beginning to materialize, not completely, not dramatically, but measurably, in the northern polar regions and the sheltered areas where the moisture was accumulating. And as it materialized, the sandworms were retreating. The Fremen, who had always been the desert people, were watching the desert shrink. The Fremen whose identity was inseparable from Shai-Hulud were watching Shai-Hulud move away from the areas where they lived. The Fremen whose religion centered on the sandworm and the spice were facing the specific possibility that the religious center of their tradition might, if the terraforming continued unchecked, eventually have nowhere near them to be centered. The political split among the Fremen of this period was real and consequential. The conservatives, the people who understood the ecological crisis as a reason to stop the terraforming, to preserve the desert ecology above the green dream, were not simply reactionaries clinging to the past. They were making a legitimate argument about what the Fremen were and what they could not afford to lose. The green world was the dream. Shai-Hulud was the reality. The dream without the reality was not the dream at all. It was something else, something that the Fremen tradition had no categories for. The progressives, the people who saw the terraforming as the fulfillment of the sacred vision, who believed that the desert god would find the accommodation that had always been intended. That Shai-Hulud would not simply disappear from a world that was becoming greener, but would find a way to exist alongside the green, were also making a legitimate argument, or at least an argument that had deep roots in the Fremen sacred tradition. Pardok Kynes had not been trying to destroy the desert. He had been trying to make the world more livable while preserving what the desert essentially was. Leto II's resolution of this crisis through the sandtrout transformation that gave him the biological capability to stop the terraforming and freeze the ecology in a configuration that he could manage was not a resolution that the Fremen tradition had the categories to understand. What the God Emperor was doing was too strange, too unprecedented, too far outside the frameworks that any previous Fremen had operated within. The response of the Fremen communities in the God Emperor period was characteristically pragmatic. They worked with what they had, maintained what they could, adapted where adaptation was required, and waited. They had always been good at waiting. The Fish Speakers, the all-female military force that Leto II developed and used across the centuries of his rule, were not Fremen exactly, but they drew from the Fremen tradition in specific ways that bear examination. They were selected from across the Imperium's populations, not specifically from Arrakis, but the training and the organizational culture that Leto II developed for them drew on the Fremen's military tradition in its emphasis on specific disciplines, on the specific relationship between individual capability and community function, on the particular forms of female authority that the Fremen Sayadina tradition had always maintained. The Fremen who lived on Arrakis under the God Emperor's rule maintained their sietches. The deep desert continued. The sandworms continued to move through the erg. The spice continued to blow. The sietch disciplines, the water counting, the stillsuit technology, the sandwalk, the krisk knife traditions, all of these continued, because the desert continued, and the desert continued to demand them. But the broader Fremen culture, the culture that was not simply the survival technology, but the full civilization, the poetry and the music and the emotional vocabulary, and the specific relationship with meaning that the desert had produced, this was under pressure. Not because Leto II was hostile to it, but because the God Emperor's rule necessarily created a different context for every culture under it, and the Fremen were not exempt from the contextualizing pressure of 3,500 years of the same ruler who had himself emerged from their tradition and transformed it through the transformation of himself. By the time of the events described in God Emperor of Dune, the Fremen who lived on Arrakis were not what the Fremen of Paul Muad'Dib's time had been. They retained the forms, some of them retained the substance, but the specific edge, the specific quality of people who were genuinely operating at the limit, who had genuinely no margin for error, who were genuinely counting every drop. This was different. The desert was still there, the worms were still there. But the pressure had been managed by a ruler who managed everything, and managed pressure is not the same as genuine pressure. The Fremen knew this, those who were attentive enough to know it. They named it in their own way, the difference between those who had the desert in their bones and those who had the desert in their memory. Memory was not nothing, but bone was more. The final chapter of the Fremen story in Herbert's completed saga is the story of Shiena and what she represented. Shiena was a girl who had grown up on Arrakis, the renamed Arrakis. The world that had been the center of the spice ecology and the Fremen tradition and the religious geography of the whole Imperium in the period 1500 years after the God Emperor's death. She was Fremen by heritage, by the specific biological and cultural inheritance that the sietches of Arrakis had maintained across those 15 centuries. She was also something more than Fremen in the conventional sense she could call sandworms, and the sandworms came to her, and the sandworms did not eat her. This had not happened before, as far as the record showed. Individual Fremen had been spared by individual sandworms in circumstances that the community sometimes interpreted as divine protection, but those were exceptional events. Ambiguous in their interpretation. Shiana walked out to meet sandworms, and the sandworms met her and responded to her in ways that the religious framework of the divided God, the theology that had grown up around Leto II's memory and his death, could not adequately explain. The Bene Gesserit were deeply interested in Shiana. Not simply because of the sandworm relationship, though that was extraordinary enough, but because of what the sandworm relationship suggested about Shiena's specific biological heritage, specifically about what genetic lines she might represent, what the God Emperor's long breeding program might have produced in her specific case. What about her made the worms respond to her as they responded to nothing else in 15 centuries of post-Leto Arrakis? What Shiena represented in the Bene Gesserit's analysis was the continuation of something, not the Fremen culture exactly, because the Fremen culture had been transformed beyond recognition from what it had been in Paul's time, but the biological heritage that the Fremen had accumulated across their long history, and that the God Emperor had been carefully managing towards specific ends. She was the living evidence that the God Emperor's program had continued to produce results even after his death, that what he had been breeding toward was still appearing in the gene pool, in specific individuals, in specific configurations that had specific and remarkable properties. She also represented the Fremen tradition at its most essential, the person who had the desert in their bones, not their memory. The girl who walked out to the sandworm without knowing that she was doing something remarkable, because the sandworm had always been there, and she had always been in relationship with it, and the relationship was simply what it was. Not performed, not mediated by theology, simply the person and the worm and the specific connection between them that the desert had produced through whatever mechanism the desert used to produce such things. When Arrakis burned, when the honoured Matras used their obliterators on the world that had been the centre of everything, the Fremen of Arrakis died with their world. 15 centuries of desert civilization, of the maintained sietches and the maintained traditions and the maintained relationship between the people of the sand and the god of the sand, this ended in hours when the planet was sterilized. What survived was the worm that Shiena had carried off the planet. One worm. The biology of Shai Hulud, the specific creature that had been the centre of the Fremen's sacred world, reduced to one individual, preserved in the hold of a ship, cared for by a girl who could call it. The Bene Gesserit used this worm to begin the creation of a new desert on Chapterhouse, the sand-trout ecology, the pre-spice stage, the creatures that sealed water in the substrate and created the aridity that sandworm biology required, spread from this one worm and began the slow process of transforming a temperate world into something that the old Fremen would have recognized. New Fremen would come eventually, not the Fremen of Arrakis, those were gone, with the world that had made them. But whoever lived on the new desert world long enough would be shaped by the same forces that had shaped the original Fremen. The desert makes the people who live in it. It always has. It always will. The eyes would go blue again. The sandwalk would be necessary again. The water would be precious again. The desert was patient. It had always been patient. The desert had been waiting for the people who could live in it since before the first human being had ever set foot on any desert world anywhere in the universe. What the Fremen story tells us about Frank Herbert's larger project is worth naming explicitly, because the Fremen were not simply a fascinating fictional culture. They were Herbert's most complete exploration of what human beings became when the environment they inhabited was taken seriously as a shaping force, when the demands of genuine extremity were allowed to do their full work on human bodies and minds and social organizations and spiritual traditions. Herbert was asking, through the Fremen, what human excellence looked like when it was not the product of comfortable development, but of genuine necessity. What discipline looked like when it was not enforced externally, but generated internally by the recognition that the alternative was death. What community looked like when it was not held together by habit and convenience, but by the specific bonds that form between people who are genuinely keeping each other alive. The answer the Fremen gave was specific and complete, and in some ways uncomfortable. Human excellence, forged by genuine necessity, was not the comfortable excellence of well-resourced achievement. It was something harder and more complete and less sympathetic to the ordinary human needs for comfort and ease. The Fremen were not sympathetic in the way that comfortable people were sympathetic to comfortable people. They had been forged in an environment that did not permit softness, and the forging showed. But they were also capable of things that comfortable excellence was not capable of. The water tears were not the tears of people who took grief lightly. They were the tears of people who had learned to measure the cost of everything and who spent those tears anyway, which made the tears more valuable than any cheap sentiment. The community built around the water economy was not a community of obligation and social convention. It was a community of genuine mutual dependence, of people who were genuinely in each other's survival, who knew it every day because the desert made the knowing unavoidable. Herbert loved the Fremen. This is evident in the specific care with which he developed them, not just the dramatic elements, but the daily life, the emotional texture, the specific forms of beauty they had developed in conditions that didn't obviously support beauty. He was also clear-eyed about them, about the cost of what the desert had made them, about the ways in which the excellence came with specific limitations and specific blindnesses, about the jihad that their capabilities and their faith made possible when given the wrong direction. The Fremen are not an ideal. They are a demonstration of what happens when the full seriousness of an environment is taken seriously in the shaping of the people who live in it, the specific brilliance and the specific costs that genuine environmental shaping produces. They are the most complete version of what Herbert was exploring throughout the saga, the relationship between the environment that shapes human beings and the human beings that are shaped by it. The question of whether we are the products of our worlds or the producers of them. The answer that we are always and only both simultaneously. The desert made the Fremen. The Fremen made the desert livable for a time. And when the world that had made them was destroyed, the desert, patient, ancient, indifferent to the politics of the creatures it shaped, simply began again. The sand trout went into the new substrate. The water began to seal. The desert was coming. And whoever lived long enough in it would become, in time, something that had never quite existed before, and was also, in all the ways that mattered, exactly what had always existed: the people of the sand, the water counters, the riders of the god that made the spice that made the universe go. The Fremen. The Fremen had a concept for the specific quality of attention that the desert required, alkias, roughly translatable as the analogy of the desert, the practice of reading the present moment through the accumulated pattern of all similar moments in memory and tradition. This was not mysticism. It was the specific cognitive discipline of people who had been reading the desert signs for survival purposes for so long that the reading had become second nature, who saw a particular configuration of sand and wind and temperature not simply as itself, but as an instance of a category, as something that had happened before in roughly this way, and whose previous occurrences could be used to understand what this occurrence meant. Alkias was how the experienced Fremen navigated the deep desert without instruments, not by guessing, by reading. The subtle signs that indicated a spice blow was imminent, the specific qualities of the sand's movement that suggested a worm was below and orienting in your direction. The temperature gradients that indicated shelter was available in a specific direction, the wind patterns that would have significance for your route. These were things that required years of specific experience to read, that no instrument could fully replicate, that were the product of the same process that all genuine expertise was the product of, sustained attention to the same domain across enough time that the patterns became visible and the reading became reliable. The master trackers of the Fremen sietch, the people whose ability to read the desert was considered most complete, were regarded with a specific kind of respect that was different from the respect given to fighters or to sayadinas. They were regarded with the respect given to people who knew something that was very hard to know, and that knowing it made possible things that would otherwise not be possible. They were the people you consulted when the desert was being difficult to read. when the signs were contradicting each other, when the pattern was ambiguous in ways that the less experienced couldn't resolve. The training of a tracker began in childhood and never quite ended. The desert was always presenting new configurations, always producing combinations of factors that hadn't been seen in exactly this form before, always requiring the adaptive application of pattern recognition to novel instances. The tracker who thought they knew everything was the tracker who died soon after. Because the desert took specific advantage of overconfidence, the Fremen had a specific understanding of courage that differed in important ways from the courage traditions of the Imperium's various military cultures. The Sardaukar courage, which was genuine, which was extraordinary, which came from the specific selection pressure of Seleucus Secundus, was a courage that operated against a background of fear, of the specific experience of confronting something dangerous and continuing to function despite the fear. This is the conventional understanding of courage in most military traditions. You are afraid, and you act anyway. Fremen courage was different in its relationship to fear. Not because the Fremen did not experience fear, they were human beings, and fear was a human experience that the desert amplified rather than eliminated, but because the specific training that the Fremen tradition developed was not primarily the training to act despite fear, but the training to not require fear as a signal for appropriate caution. The Fremen word for the relevant quality was waqar, dignity or composure, but in the specific sense of a person who has integrated the appropriate responses to danger so completely that the responses no longer require the emotional signal of fear to trigger. A Fremen fighter with full waqar did not need to be afraid of the worm to move correctly when the worm was coming. The appropriate movement had been integrated to the level where it happened without the delay that fear recognition action required. The Fremen fighter with full waker did not need to be afraid of the Harkonnen soldier to assess the situation correctly and respond with maximum efficiency. This is not the absence of emotion. It is the specific discipline of a people who had found that emotion, while genuine and important, was not always the most reliable guide to action in conditions where the time between stimulus and required response was very short and the cost of delay was death. The Fremen valued emotion highly. The water tears are the evidence of this, the specific extravagance of genuine grief in the face of loss. But they had developed, through the desert's demands, the ability to separate the appropriate action from the emotional signal, to perform the action and feel the emotion without requiring the emotion to precede the action. The result was something that observers from outside the Fremen tradition consistently described as uncanny, a quality of calm in crisis situations that looked, to people accustomed to crisis responses involving visible emotional activation, like the absence of normal human response. It was not the absence, it was the specific form that the Fremen's normal human response had taken after generations of the desert's training. The role of water in Fremen intimacy is worth examining, because it illuminates something about the Fremen emotional life that the focus on the water economy as a survival mechanism can obscure. Water given voluntarily was the highest form of gift. This was not simply a cultural convention, it was the most direct possible expression of what the Fremen value system produced when it was applied to interpersonal relationships. To give someone water was to give them the thing that the desert made most precious, the thing that your own survival depended on, the thing that you had counted and measured and protected with the care that humans normally reserved for their most important possessions. To give it to someone else was to say, "Your survival matters to me at least as much as my own." This was not a metaphor, it was a literal statement made in the literal currency of desert life. The water gift was given in specific contexts that the Fremen tradition had developed over centuries. A naib who distributed water to a community in hard times was expressing political leadership in the form of material sacrifice. A parent who gave water to a child was expressing the specific quality of parental care, not sentiment, but the actual willingness to take on additional risk to one's own survival for the child's sake. A friend who gave water to a friend in genuine need was expressing the friendship in the only form that the desert permitted to be unambiguous. The romantic and erotic dimensions of water giving were specific to the Fremen and fascinating. In a culture where all physical resources were precious, the specific forms that physical intimacy took carried the weight of resource allocation. The offering of one's body to another was not simply an emotional or physical act, but an act with material dimensions. Because bodies were water-containing and water was precious, the Fremen lovers' tradition had developed around this in ways that gave physical intimacy a weight and seriousness that other cultures' traditions didn't always carry. Not that Fremen lovemaking was grim, the tradition had its playful elements, its specific forms of sensory delight, the specific aesthetic of people who had learned to find beauty in constrained forms. But the weight was there, in the background of every intimate encounter, and it gave those encounters a depth of significance that contributed to the Fremen's characteristic intensity in personal relationships. Paul and Chani's relationship was shaped by all of this. The specific quality of their intimacy, the way it was described in the novels as something immediate and genuine and serious in a way that was different from the more conventional relationship with Irulan, was the quality of intimacy between people who shared the Fremen framework, who understood what it meant to be in relationship with each other in the desert's terms. Even though Paul had not grown up Fremen, he had absorbed enough of the framework through the years in the sietch, through Chani's teaching, through the specific integration of the desert's demands into his own way of being, that the relationship could take its full Fremen form. The political structures of the Fremen after the jihad, in the period when they had effectively become the governors of the Imperium through Paul's control of the spice, were characterized by a tension that the Fremen tradition had never had to manage before. The Fremen had always been a people without external political power. This was the defining condition of their political life. They had no standing in the Imperium's formal structures. No representation in the Landsraad, no recognized authority beyond the sietches themselves. Their political traditions were developed for stateless people, for a community that had to manage its own internal affairs without external recognition, and without the resources that recognized political authority could mobilize. Now they had Paul as emperor. Now they had the most powerful single person in the Imperium as one of their own, not by birth, but by the specific process of becoming that the Fremen tradition recognized as more meaningful than birth. The Fremen had, in a real sense, become the people who ran the universe. This was uncomfortable in ways that the mythology didn't capture. The Fremen were not prepared for political power at the Imperium scale. They were not trained for the diplomatic arts of the Landsraad. They were not experienced in the institutional governance of planetary populations that had not been shaped by the same traditions and the same demands. The capabilities that made them extraordinary in the desert and in the specific kind of warfare the desert had prepared them for did not automatically translate into the capabilities that running an interstellar empire required. Some Fremen adapted. The most politically intelligent members of the Fremen community, the Naibs and the Sayadinas, who had been managing the complex internal politics of the sietch network for decades, had the fundamental political skills that Imperium-level governance also required, though the scale was different and the specific content was very different. They could assess situations, manage interests, find accommodations between competing needs, maintain the trust of people who depended on them. These were the capabilities that politics required at any scale. Others did not adapt, or adapted in ways that were damaging. The Fremen fighting tradition was extraordinary. The Fremen governing tradition was not developed for what governance at this scale required. The gap produced specific kinds of failure. The kind of failure that happens when excellent people are placed in positions that require different kinds of excellence than they possess. Paul saw this. He also saw his inability to fully address it, because addressing it would have required either spending the prescient capacity he was using for the jihad on internal governance development, which was not available given the scale of what was happening, or accepting a slower evolution of the Fremen governing capability than the immediate situation permitted. He made the choices available to him, which were not good choices, which were the best available among options that were all inadequate. Stilgar's arc across the Paul period and into the Alia Regency is one of the most important stories in the Fremen history of this time, and it is a story that is partly about Stilgar and partly about what the Fremen as a community were going through. Stilgar had made a specific choice not to challenge Paul for leadership, and he had lived with the consequences of that choice across the years of the jihad and the consolidation. The choice was not a betrayal of the Fremen tradition. It was an accommodation of the tradition to circumstances the tradition had never anticipated, but it left Stilgar in a position that was genuinely new. The nabe of a sietch whose nabe was now emperor, who had accepted a secondary role in relation to a figure who had grown beyond any Fremen category, who was maintaining his community and his community's values in the shadow of something that his tradition had been preparing for, but that the preparing had not fully imagined. His loyalty to Paul was real. It was the loyalty of a naib who had assessed a person and found them genuinely worthy, not the loyalty of a person who had simply been swept along by the mythological tide. He continued to assess Paul across the years of the jihad, continued to find him worthy, continued to give him the specific quality of trust that Fremen tradition reserved for the genuinely capable rather than the merely powerful. His relationship with Alia during the Regency period was more complex. Alia was extraordinary. Stilgar recognized this as clearly as anyone. She was also, from his perspective, strange in ways that the Fremen tradition gave him the vocabulary to identify as potentially dangerous, a person who had accessed too much, who had never had the experience of genuine limitation that the desert required of everyone who lived in it, whose specific power came without the specific costs that the desert had always attached to power. He managed the relationship with Alia with the pragmatic patience that he managed everything. He maintained his role, maintained his community's integrity, found the accommodations that allowed the sietch to continue functioning while the political situation around it underwent the specific deterioration of the Alia Regency period. He was not able to prevent what happened. He was able to maintain a specific core of Fremen identity and Fremen practice that survived what happened and provided the foundation for what came after. When Leto II's transformation became apparent, when the child who had been his naib's son revealed that he had merged with the sand trout and begun the biological metamorphosis that would eventually produce the god emperor, Stilgar's response was again characteristically Fremen. He assessed what he saw. He applied the tradition as best he could to something the tradition had not anticipated, and he maintained his community's function in the context of something he could not entirely understand. He was a good naib. He was a good Fremen. He was a man who had spent his life doing the desert's work with the specific quality of excellence that the desert demanded, and who had maintained that quality through circumstances that no desert tradition had prepared him for. The Dune saga contains many extraordinary figures: Paul, Leto II, Alia, Chani, Jessica. Stilgar is the extraordinary, ordinary figure. The person who represents what the Fremen actually were when they were at their best, capable, loyal, adaptable, patient, and grounded in a reality that all the prescient vision and all the Bene Gesserit training and all the God Emperor's 3,000-year program could not entirely replace. The Fremen of Arrakis in the Heretics period had maintained something essential despite everything. Not everything. 15 centuries of distance from the most intense version of the tradition had done its inevitable work. But the sietches still existed. The deep desert still had Fremen who knew the sandwalk and maintained the water discipline and carried the crysknife with a specific understanding of what carrying it meant. The poetry was different from what it had been in Paul's time, but it was still specifically Fremen poetry, still organized around the water imagery, still doing the work of transmitting the tradition through the form that the tradition had always used. Sheena emerged from this tradition as its most remarkable product in the Heretics period, not despite the 15 centuries of partial dilution, but in some ways because of it. The tradition had been maintained, but it had also been under pressure, and the pressure had done what pressure always did to the Fremen tradition. It had selected for those who were most fully and genuinely part of it, who maintained it because it was genuinely theirs, rather than because the immediate environment made non-maintenance impossible. Her ability to call worms was not fully explained by the existing Fremen tradition, and the Fremen of Arrakis knew it wasn't. They understood that what she was doing was not the conventional worm riding that Fremen had been doing for millennia. The worm came to her before she planted the thumper. The worm responded to her in ways that were different from the ways it responded to a maker hook. The relationship was different in kind, not just in degree. The Bene Gesserit, who had been waiting and watching for something like this, recognized it as significant. The Fremen of Arrakis, who had been waiting and watching for something like the Lisan al-Gaib's fulfillment in various forms since the Missionaria Protectiva had seeded the tradition millennia ago, recognized it as sacred. Neither recognition was wrong. Both were pointing at something real, at the specific intersection of genetic legacy and individual expression that the God Emperor's long program had produced in this particular person at this particular time. What Sheena represented in the larger story of the Fremen was the specific proof of something that the Fremen tradition had always maintained, that the desert made its people through a process that was deeper than culture, that the shaping was biological as well as social, that whoever was shaped by the desert deeply enough would carry something that could not be fully replicated through cultural transmission alone. You could teach the sandwalk, you could not teach the worm relationship. Whatever that was, it came from somewhere else, from the specific biological legacy of thousands of years of people living in the spice ecology, absorbing the spice, being shaped by the spice, becoming what the spice and the desert and the worm ecology together made of the human raw material that they worked with. The burning of Arrakis was the end of the Fremen as a people with a continuous place. Not the end of the biology. The biology was in the preserved worm that Sheena had carried off the planet, and biology is patient. Not the end of the tradition. The Bene Gesserit carried fragments of it in other memory, and what is in other memory does not disappear simply because the people who originally lived it are gone. Not even the end of the possibility of new Fremen, because the desert makes the Fremen, and the desert was being made again on Chapter House. But it was the end of the specific continuity, the unbroken chain of sietches and naibs and sayadinias and krisknife, ceremonies and water counts that had been running since the first. Then Sunni refugees had arrived on Arrakis and discovered that the planet was as harsh as anything they had survived before, and that surviving it would require everything they had and more. The chain broke when Arrakis burned. What continued was the possibility. The sand trouts spreading through the Chapter House substrate, the desert beginning its slow work on a world that had been temperate. The biology of the Fremen encoded in the genetics of the preserved worm and in the genetics of the people who carried the heritage, Sheena herself, others who carried the specific biological legacy of thousands of years of desert living. The desert makes the Fremen. Wherever the desert goes, wherever the sandworm ecology establishes itself, wherever human beings live long enough and deeply enough inside the spice ecology to be changed by it, there, in time, will be Fremen. Not these Fremen. Not the Fremen of Sietch Tabba and Stilgar's quiet authority and Chani's water gift and Paul's tears over Jamis. Those Fremen were specific to Arrakis and to the specific historical moment that Arrakis created, but something continuous with them, something that carries the essential shape of what they were, will be produced wherever the desert is. The desert remembers. This is the final thing to say about the Fremen, because it is the thing the desert's nature makes true in a way that goes beyond cultural continuity or biological inheritance. The desert produces what the desert produces when it is allowed to do its work on human beings across enough time. It always has, it always will, and what it produces, the specific excellence, the specific limitation, the specific beauty and the specific cost of the people shaped by genuine extremity. This is something that the comfortable world does not produce and cannot replicate and has. Across the history of every civilization that has ever existed in comfortable circumstances, consistently underestimated until the moment that it encountered it and discovered its mistake. The Harkonnens discovered their mistake in the Coriolis storm. The Sardaukar discovered their mistake in the Maker's charge. The Imperium discovered its mistake in a desert war that lasted 2 years and consumed the political structure of 10,000 years. The lesson was, as old as the Fremen and as old as the desert, the comfortable world does not understand what genuine extremity produces in the people it shapes. It doesn't understand because it hasn't been through it. It doesn't understand because the categories it has developed for understanding human beings were built in comfortable circumstances, for comfortable people, by comfortable thinkers who had the luxury of being wrong about the full scope of human possibility without dying for the mistake. The desert has no such luxury. The desert is always right in the specific sense that the desert's demands are always exactly what they are and never less, and the people who meet those demands correctly survive and the people who don't die. The correctness is not negotiable. The Fremen met those demands. Across thousands of years, across the full scope of what the desert asked, from the water counting to the worm riding to the tears that were the most expensive luxury in the known universe. They met those demands, and what they became is the full answer to the question of what the desert was asking. The water is still sacred. Shai Hulud is still the god. The Kreis knife is still drawn, somewhere, by people who know what drawing it means. The eyes are still blue where the spice runs deep. The Fremen endure.